So, those that know me, and know what I do, call me the cleaner. I'm what you might call a bounty hunter, except I deal with very special cases. The stuff that nobody else can really handle. I seek out the filth, the otherworldly beings, even what you might think is supernatural, and I terminate it. I don't discriminate. I don't hesitate. I just squeeze the trigger. I'm not open for hire. I only take contracts from one person. And no, I can't bring you into the fold. It's something you're born into, and there's only ever a handful of us alive at a time. I can't go too far into the details, but I am allowed to say this. It all starts with a slip of paper, usually an envelope in the mail. Sometimes, though, in very rare cases, I'll get a letter in person. I call her Star. She's not allowed to tell me her real name, and Star isn't her code name. Traditionally, someone like her would just be called a messenger. Nothing else, that's all they are. I call her Star, though. She has a real bright personality. Figured it fit. Now, I'm going to share a story with you all. I'm not really a storyteller, so you'll have to forgive me if the format is weird. But I'll let you in on my life and peel back the curtain just a little. I had a case a few years back. It started, like I said, with a knock at the door, which always gets my heart pumping. You see, we cleaners don't have friends, and we don't visit each other, so a knock at the door can only mean one thing. Star is there, waiting with a special case. I unlocked the deadbolt, grabbed the cold doorknob, and slowly edged the door open. There was Star, as expected, greeting me with the huge smile she always had on. "Morning, Mr. Clean. How you doing?" she asked politely, moving her bangs out of her eyes. I returned the smile and motioned for her to enter. Still alive, so I'm doing better than most of the people I know. We made our way into the kitchen, and I poured her a glass of water, something I always did for a messenger. I'm going to take a wild guess and assume this isn't a social visit. I handed her the glass of water. "Oh, thank you." She took the glass and sipped on it before replying. "You know, one of these days I'm just going to pop by to hang out." It was a nice thought, but I knew it could never happen. It's against the rules, and no one breaks the rules. "But you're right." She pulled an envelope from her back pocket. "This one is gonna be a bit tough." There were 2 pictures. Usually, I only got one. She placed them on the table. The photos were of 2 monstrous-looking beasts, hairy and huge. I instantly recognized what they were, and immediately got a pit in my stomach. The Star must have noticed, because she responded with a reassuring pat on the back. "You can do it." They were lycanthropes, or more commonly known as werewolves. They're about as tough as it gets. "Yeah, probably, but 2? Really?" I shook my head and sighed. Am I to take them on alone? Yuppers, and we both know what that means. She paused to drink more water. They're mating, so we're gonna need you to deal with this as quickly as possible, and can't be giving them a chance to separate and disappear. Lycanthropes are pretty much what they appear to be like in the movies. Vicious, strong, fast, practically the perfect killing machine. In real life, though, they don't have any special weaknesses. They die the same way as everything else, and the best way to do it is blood loss. Explosives work well too, but that can get a little messy. I prefer hit-and-run tactics. That's a problem when there's 2, though. You have to severely injure both of them before they have the chance to rip you to shreds. It's preferred to take them out before they have the chance to morph. You've got a 50-50 on that, though. Normally, you won't see 2 in the same place because they're very territorial. I groaned again. All right, I'll do it. Give me 2 weeks tops. If I don't check in, I'm dead. Contact 2 if that happens. She can take over the case." "I doubt it'll come to that." Star was always confident in my abilities. "You always come out on top, one way or another." I snickered. "Yeah, well, just give me the details. The sooner I plan this mission, the better." I was awarded with a laugh from Star. "Yes, sir. So, here's what we got." So, of course, I can't actually go into the details of the locations and the contacts we use in the area. All I can say is that the events went down in a town in the States. I'm sure the more curious of you will try to search for news reports and whatnot, but I promise you that you're not going to find anything. Any shred of evidence that was there is gone. My family's been doing this for a very long time. We're a lot better at this than you are. You'll find nothing. Now, when a cleaner goes looking for information, there's really only one thing that can give you reliable facts. An imp. That's what we call them. They don't really have a name in the English language. They're half human, half, I guess what you call a demon. They're as close to human as monsters can get. I know that may sound scary, but there's a reason we call them imps. They're small, weak, feeble creatures. The only thing they have going for them is their longevity. They're pretty much immortal, and only a handful of them are still living. So being that they pose no threat, we don't put them on the kill list. Imps are good for one thing and one thing only: information gathering. Ins and outs, they know it all. And for a price, they'll tell you everything you need to know. So when I arrived at the small town, I arranged a meeting with the local imp via my contacts. Naturally, he wanted to meet in a public place. The otherworldly aren't really trusting of us cleaners. It was the middle of the day when we met. I spotted him sitting on the bench, right in the middle of the park. And to the average passerby, he might have just looked like a small, odd-looking middle-aged man, not worth more than 2 looks. I instantly noted the signs, though. Pointed left ear, hunched posture, 1 red eye and 1 blue. Imps all have the same disfigurements. They can easily blend in with contacts and whatnot, though. You might have even met one before without knowing it. I plopped down next to him. "Mind if we cut to the chase, imp?" The imp grunted and turned to face me, his thick brows already furrowed. "Ah, you're all the same, you cleaners. Been dealing with you lot for over a century. Always impatient. Never enough time to chat, eh?" He sighed deeply, obviously not wanting to be here. I shrugged my shoulders. "Sorry if I don't stop to ask you about the weather. I've got a job to do, and neither of us gets paid by the hour. Now, tell me about the doggies." The imp looked at me, eyebrows still furrowed, notably displeased with my response. Well, treating them like dogs will definitely get you 6 feet under." I didn't respond, silently encouraging him to continue. "There's 2 of them. They're young, early, maybe mid-20s. They're gonna be strong, but you've got the upper hand with experience, I would think." He paused as a mother and her rather chubby kid passed by. 3 victims so far, but they're all human, so they won't be ready for something like you." He scratched his hairy chin and looked at me with his mismatched eyes. "The female's name is Karen, the other, Brandon." "And where are Karen and Brandon staying?" "There's a lodge in the woods, east all the way at the back. They're on private property. They stay there on the weekends." Are we done yet? I need a nap. "Last question. Why haven't they been caught yet? 3 is a lot of missing people." The imp was quick to respond. "They only take homeless, and people that won't be missed." And before I could ask anything else, he was up on his feet hobbling away. "Good luck, cleaner. You're gonna need it. Can't say that I'm gonna miss you if you die." He cackled as he walked away. Charming creatures, He was right. I'd need all the luck. Killing one werewolf is difficult, and killing two approaches impossible. You've got a plan, weigh the risks heavily, and hope it all goes smooth. And it has to go smooth. Bearing that in mind, I rested up, got familiar with the terrain, and eventually I found myself hiking through the thickest parts of the forest a few days later. It was dark. Not a single hint of moonlight was able to push its way through the thick canopy. I decided that it would be better to take them out after daylight hours. By then, they'd have their next victim all ready, and the feast would be underway. Werewolves are emotional creatures, so I could only hope that they were caught up in the ritual. And pitiful that I had to let a civilian die in the process, but not all hunts are without collateral damage. I took about half an hour of wading through the thick trees before I started approaching a clearing. I could see the small cabin in the distance. At first glance, it was quite homely looking. Wooden walls, a fireplace smoking, even a sign that said welcome. There was one thing that did break the illusion, however. The screams. The bone-chilling screams of a man whose flesh was being peeled from his bones. I could see him, laying on a table, arms and legs strapped down, a man and a woman standing over him. The man had a large blade and was slicing through his skin like it was butter. They were chanting in an old language, one that doesn't even have a name. Their voices were guttural and a deeper pitch than humans were possible of making. It was the mating ceremony. They flayed the victim alive, eat the skin, drain the blood into buckets, and then smear themselves in the blood. It was a sick and twisted ritual, and I didn't give them the chance to finish it. I looked down the iron sights of my rifle and picking my first target, the male, Brandon. The first shot ripped through the forest until it found its mark. The bullet tore through the man's chest, stopping his heart in an instant. Blood spattered on the ground as he slumped to his knees and fell to his face. Karen reacted almost instantaneously and dashed behind the trees to the right of the house. I expected that, though. Werewolf reflexes were remarkable even when in human form. I already knew what would happen next. She would change and become the monster that I was sent to kill. The werewolf transformation is a slow, excruciatingly painful process. So I've heard, at least. Bones grow and break to morph the body into a massive beast. Hair stabs through the skin, creating roots where none existed before. Their teeth all fall out one by one and are replaced by vicious fangs. Finger and toenails are pushed out, and in their place, only sharp bones remain, twice as long, strong, and sharp. Close-quarter combat against them is, well, a terrible idea. Almost always fatal. I sighed and checked my surroundings. There were no signs of Karen. Maybe she... An abrupt, inhuman screech tore through the forest. It was distant, but they were known for their ability to cover ground fast. Everything got quiet after that. Oh, hell. I could feel the tremor in my hand already. Her transformation was complete, and I had just killed her lover. Again, they're emotional creatures, passionate to their very core. I emptied the chamber of my rifle and pushed another round in. It wasn't human anymore. Slowly, I started making my way towards the lodge and taking care not to make the slightest of sounds. I was inching my way to the ritual table. Help me. I could hear the man croak out as I neared. Oh, they're gonna kill me. Please, help me. His voice was getting weaker. I looked over his bloody mess of a body, or at least, what was left of it. You need to call an ambulance. His breathing was more labored now, wheezing as his lungs fought for oxygen. I rested my hand on his forehead. It's gonna be all right. Close your eyes. I'll take it from here. He tried to say something more, but his eyes slowly drifted shut, and his breathing eventually stopped. It was a shitty way to die. I let my eyes trail down to the other dead man, Brandon, the lycanthrope. He was young, brown hair, blue eyes, and a hole in his chest. On the surface level, you can't even tell that they aren't human. There's no giveaway like there is with the imps. Werewolves are hard to find, unless, of course, they're morphed and hunting you. I nudged him with my boot. No movement. Good, I thought. I stepped over his body and moved towards their cabin. I had to shut myself in. I needed to trap the beast. I opened the door slowly, pushing it with my rifle, making sure to close it behind me. The fireplace was still lit, making the shadows dance on the walls. Very homely indeed, I said absent-mindedly. And it was. There wasn't much to it, but it was nice. A sofa and recliner by the fire. A kitchen past that. No TV, though. I looked back at the dead body outside. I guess they've got other interests. There were paintings on the walls, mostly of wolves and the such. Brandon's signature was on a few of them. I guess he was a painter when he wasn't busy being a werewolf. Another screech tore through the forest, much closer this time. It was stalking the tree line, deciding how to attack. I snapped back to the task at hand. Right, best get to it then. I needed to immobilize the beast. I smiled as I dropped my duffel bag to the floor and set aside 2 large bear traps. Even a lycanthrope can't ignore steel teeth biting into his bones. I placed one by the door, maybe 5 feet away, and one by the window next to the fireplace. This ought to do. I waited and I waited. 3 hours went by before I heard it again. The beast was smart to wait that long. I was tired, and the recliner was definitely helping me to fall asleep, especially with the warmth of the fire. But the second I heard it, my adrenaline kicked into overdrive. It was circling the house, heavy footfalls making solid thuds. It made no attempt to hide its presence, growling every other breath. Werewolves were masters at stalking their prey. You can only hear them when they want you to. It's no wonder she was able to get to the house without me noticing. She wanted me, intimidated as I was. I could hear the slow scraping of her talons as she carved into the house. The low, guttural growl as she grew bolder with each step. The cabin shook violently as something smashed against it, and paintings fell from the walls. My body trembled, and then it went quiet. No more footsteps. No more growling. It was in kill mode. Ah, shit. Every hair on my body was at attention. Goosebumps rose on my arms, and the tremor in my hand returned. All the experience in the world can't save you from the terror of a pissed-off lycanthrope. I took a deep breath and slowly stood from the chair, rifle in hand. I doused the fire and positioned myself in the center of the room, equal distance to either of the traps. With the fire out, it was dark, and hopefully, it wouldn't see the bear traps. You will die. It was a deep, almost demonic thing to hear a werewolf talk. Before I could react, the beast burst through the front door. I had to duck as the door flew past my head and crashed into the kitchen. There wasn't much light, but I could see enough. Maybe 8 feet tall, black fur, several 100 pounds. It was frightening. Muscles bulging, eyes glaring, fangs bared. It was pissed at me. I couldn't afford to waste a second, though. I raised the rifle and opened fire. Shot after shot, 3 times I fired on the beast. The attack barely phased it as it only walked closer. The bullets ripped through its body, and blood slowly leaked out, coating the monster with a crimson glow. But it didn't care. They're tough. I just had to buy time, wait for it to step into the trap. That's it. Come on and get me, I shouted, squeezing the trigger once more. The bullet hit its ear and the beast roared in anger. Just one more step and I had the damn thing. Yeah, that. It stopped right in front of the trap and leaned forward so that its head was in the moonlight. Ears flat against its wolf-like skull, gray eyes staring down at me as it bared its fangs. You. It flung the bear trap to the side, causing it to clatter against the wall and snapped shut. Die now. It roared menacingly, and before I could react, it lunged at me, clearing the distance in one leap. It swatted me like a fly and sent me crashing into the fireplace. I hit hard and nearly cracked my skull open on the brick. Her sharp claws had sliced through my vest like butter and gashed me open. Everything was blurry, and my head felt like it was swimming in circles. I managed to push myself off the floor. I was greeted with another ear-splitting screech. I felt my eardrums pop as I fell back against the fireplace. Even from across the room, I could feel how hot its breath was, and the smell, it reeked of death. But I couldn't afford not to act. I reached for the pistol on my belt and opened fire again. I was dazed, but I got lucky. The bullet hit it square in the head. It wasn't enough to kill it, not by a long shot, but it gave me a chance to move. I could see it fall back and break the small dining table it was next to. It was distorted, and I used that to make my way to the window. I stumbled as I walked, almost falling on the trap that I had set earlier. I lifted the glass plane and threw myself onto the window sill. I let my body slowly slide out the other side. I needed to put distance between us and formulate a new plan. Hell! My ankle erupted in pain. I could hear an audible pop as the werewolf crushed my bone with its grip, while also digging its claws into my skin. It had caught my leg just as I was sliding out. You bitch! I shouted. My entire leg felt as though it was on fire. I was in a bad spot, more or less dangling out of the window. I could see its head sticking halfway out of the window now. You are... I fired multiple rounds into its jaw, not giving it a chance to finish its sentence. The beast jerked its head back, smashing the top of the window as it did. I felt my ankle slip from its grip and my head smash on the ground as I fell onto the grass. I couldn't stand. My vision was fading, and the last thing I could hear was the beast pounding on the walls. Ugh. I groaned as I sat forward. I was alive, but only barely. I was in a puddle of my own blood, and I couldn't use my left leg. It took me nearly 10 minutes to stand up, and another few to hobble over to the cabin window. What was left of it anyway. Karen the werewolf was seemingly dead. I leaned myself against the walls and peered inside. From what I could see, it looked as though the beast had bled out. Several bullet wounds, and a bear trap still clamped on his ankle. Guess you stepped on it right before you snatched up my leg, I said to myself, with large pieces of glass sticking out of the back of its head. Looks like you died trying to break down the wall, though. I pulled my burner out of my pocket and dialed my only contact. Mission is a success. I'm gonna need a cleanup crew and a pickup for myself. Oh, and bring Helga. I'm hurt pretty bad. I let myself slide down against the wall. I drifted off looking at the stars. They looked especially dull that night. It took me a few days to wake up from that. Spent even longer in recovery. Witch doctors can only get you so far. That's the story for now, though. You don't have to believe me, but I assure you, some of the legends of old are true. I might post again. I've got plenty to tell. For now, though, I've got business to attend to. I went camping a few weeks ago. I wanted to be alone after my recent breakup and thought some quiet time with nature would help clear my head. I picked a mountain at random in New Hampshire. I'm not gonna tell you which one. Honestly, I can't even remember. It took that from me. I drove up on a Friday and started my hike around noon. I made it halfway to the top and found a good place to pop my little tent. I set up camp and gathered some wood for a fire. It was cold, but I didn't mind. It felt good and cleared my head. By the time I finished setting up, it was dark. I turned on my electric lantern and set to work starting a fire. Soon, I had a couple logs crackling, and I sat close, rubbing my hands together and listening to the silence. Getting lost in my thoughts, I wondered why I hadn't seen anyone else today. It was an odd time to go hiking, but I thought I'd at least see one or two other people. It didn't matter. I was content to be left alone. Eventually, I ate a late dinner and decided to turn in for the night. The cold was making me sleepy, and I figured if I went to bed a little early, I could get an early start. Burying myself under a pile of sleeping bags, I drifted off to sleep. It didn't last long. Sometime around 2 a.m, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The noise faint and muffled. It sounded far away, but it was enough to break the silence of night. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, training my ears. What was that? And then it hit me. People were singing happy birthday. I unzipped my tent and stuck my head out into the darkness. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was coming from way out in the woods, the notes creeping between the black trees toward me. It was strange and a little creepy, hearing that out there in the middle of nowhere. I listened for a few more seconds, noticing how sad it sounded. There was no joy in the voices I heard, none of the usual birthday glee. It sounded like a funeral song, dreary and slow. After a few seconds, the people stopped singing, and then they started over from the beginning. Creeped out and slightly confused, I zipped up my tent and buried myself under my sleeping bags again. I covered my head to block out the noise, shutting my eyes and willing sleep to come. I couldn't hear the voices anymore. I swallowed hard, trying not to think about it. Trying not to think about how my birthday was the next day. I eventually fell asleep, the cold closing my eyes and pulling me down into the darkness of slumber. The next day I rose early and decided I'd keep my camp where it was. I pulled out my small pack and loaded it with supplies for a day hike. I wanted to hike to the top and stay there for a few hours with intent to hike back to my camp before dark. The trail was a little rough, in obvious need of some grooming, but I enjoyed the challenge. I stopped a few times, about once an hour, to catch my breath and snack on some trail mix. Eventually, I broke through the tree line, and after another hour of hard hiking, I made it to the summit. Once I was up there, I was again surprised to find myself alone. Not a soul to be seen in any direction. I found a good place to sit down and ate while scanning the majestic view around me. A cold wind cut into my coat, and I pulled my hood up. I shut my watering eyes and rested my head against the rock I was sitting against. I fell asleep. When I awoke, I didn't know what time it was, but the sun was going down. Dark splashes of infected purple bled across the sky. The wind was even colder, my whole body shivering against it. I rubbed my arms together as I watched the sun wink out behind the distant mountains. I had maybe half an hour to make it back to my camp before total darkness. That wasn't nearly enough time. I didn't know what to do, torn between staying or trying my luck on the trail. I was afraid I'd freeze to death if I stayed, afraid I'd break my neck if I left. After much internal debate, I sat back down. I had to tough it out and hope I'd make it. I was scared. I pulled my arms into my sleeves and wrapped them around my body. I curled up on the stones and pulled the hood over my head, cutting my view back down to a thin line. I don't know how long I lay there, until I noticed it. It was off to my left, about 10 feet from me on the edge of my vision. It was a birthday cake. It sat on the rocks with a single lit candle stuck in it. The flame danced in the wind, threatening to extinguish. I sat up, my heart thundering. I looked around in the darkness, prodding the shadows with my eyes, searching for whomever had left it there. Nothing. It was full dark now, a sliver of cold moon hanging in the sky like a bright smile, like it was in on the joke. Even with the light it cast, I didn't see anyone or anything. All the shadows were frozen in place, waiting out the night like I was. I slowly crawled over to the cake and looked down at it. The flame was holding on to the wick for its dear life, the wind viciously trying to tear it away. The frosting was white, the cream hardening in the open air. There was something written on it, something in red. You are dead. I backed away, suddenly feeling very exposed. I didn't want to stay here anymore. I had to try and make it back to my tent. I stood up, teeth chattering, and noticed my day pack was gone. I spun around, convinced I had just misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be seen. Scared and frustrated, I started back towards the nearest cairn. I stumbled in the darkness, each step a prayer. I squinted against the shadows, trying to see the formation of stone beneath my feet. As I made it the 100 yards to the first cairn, I tripped and went sprawling, smacking my face against the indifferent rocks. I felt my upper lip split and my nose crunch as I made contact. Warmth flowed down my chin as I blinked back stars, sucking in sharp breaths on the ground. As I got up, legs shaking, I wiped a thick trail of blood from my face. I was dizzy, the blood chilling in the wind and crusting on my chin and hand. I ran my tongue along my lip and felt where it split. I winced. I should have known I couldn't make it. Not even off the top of the mountain, and I had almost brained myself dead. I wiped the rest of my face clean and took a few deep breaths to steady myself. I looked up from the cairn, which was next to a steep drop-off, and noticed something else. The mountain had grown. I shook my head, convinced I was just seeing things wrong in the moonlight. But I wasn't. As I looked out onto the vast mountain landscape, I noticed that the peaks of all the other mountains were far below the summit on which I stood. That hadn't been the case a few hours ago. It was as if the mountain had shot up another couple 100 feet, rising silently through the dark sky. How could that be, though? It didn't make any sense. Nothing about the night made sense. Not knowing what to make of my new discovery, I ran my hands over my body, checking for any serious injuries from my fall. I seemed to be intact. I looked around the bald expanse of rock, feeling the wind slice into me like a razor. It was then that I wondered if I was going to die out here. My fingers were numb from the cold, my blue lips trembled, and I didn't know what to do. I had already fallen once, but I had to keep going. The wind was going to kill me. I wouldn't last all night if I didn't find some shelter. I told myself to just be careful and take it one step at a time. If I kept my body moving, I could at least generate some heat. I squinted in the moonlight, trying to make out the next cairn, the pile of rocks that marked the trail. Even with the moon, I didn't see it, but I remember the general direction. Taking a deep breath, I started moving again. It was agony, working my way off the summit. It battered my knees and hands countless times, my feet doing their best to hold traction. The wind was relentless, smacking me in the face with an open fist. I almost fell to my death a few times, but my quick reflexes kept me seconds ahead of the end. I was breathing heavily, my frozen muscles exhausted. I don't know how long I descended, making my way to the distant tree line below. I didn't see any more cairns and knew that I was probably lost. No more trail markers. I didn't care at that point. I just needed to get out of the wind. It felt like no matter how many steps I took, I wasn't getting any closer to my destination. The endless plod, the careful, patient progression. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. The moon seemed frozen in the sky. I looked out and saw the distant mountaintops still far below. I checked my watch and saw that it was 2 a.m. I had been walking for 2 hours now. I'm never gonna make it, I thought. I blew into my frozen hands, trying vainly to warm them. Just keep walking. Don't stop. You're dead if you stop. I continued my descent. It was 4 hours or so until sunrise. I just had to make it until then. I shuddered. There was no way I was going to make it 4 hours. And that's when I saw it. It was about 50 feet down to my right, nestled against an outcrop of rock formations. A tent. I breathed a sigh of relief. I was saved. There was even a small fire crackling beside it, sheltered from the wind by stones. I forced myself not to run, continuing the snail-paced descent towards it. I wasn't alone up here. I wasn't going to die. But as I approached it, with the light from the fire casting shadows on the tent, I paused. I was about 5 feet from it, the wind partially blocked by a stone wall on my right. I took a step closer, cautious. I heard something from inside. It sounded like someone sucking in big, wet lungfuls of air. And then the tent started shaking violently. I froze, heart thundering, fear creeping up my spine. The sound of the person inside continued, desperate, urgent breaths sucked down into mucus-coated lungs. The tent kept shaking, the plastic and nylon vibrating as if whatever was inside was having a seizure. And then I felt a tremor run through the stone under my feet. I quickly caught my balance, steadying myself, terrified and confused. What the hell was happening? After a few seconds, the mountain calmed, along with the tent. It was silent except for the wind. I took a few uncertain breaths, desperate to warm myself by the fire. I eyed the tent, preparing myself to speak. The flap to the tent unzipped, just a few inches. I felt my body lock and my eyes widen, my mind suddenly screaming that I was in danger. A voice came from the opening, a wet, deep whisper. Happy birthday. I turned and ran, stumbling and tripping, bruising my body in a desperate need to get away. My heart pounded in my chest, confusion and panic pulsing through my bloodstream. The air tore at my face, trying to rip it away with frozen claws. I raced toward the trees. They were closer now than I thought, each fumbled step bringing me nearer. I didn't know what was going on and didn't understand what was happening. There was something very wrong with the mountain and I desperately needed to find my way off of it. My limbs were shaken by the time I crashed through the trees. I had countless scrapes and bruises running along up and down my body, a testament to my hurried descent. Blood dried quickly in the cold air, and I felt patches of it gripping my skin along my arms. I stopped, now in the sanctuary of the trees, and sucked in hungry lungfuls of air. I placed a hand over my chest and willed my heart to slow. I licked my cracked lips and rolled my head up to stare at the sky, catching my breath. What was that? What was in that tent? After a few minutes, I assessed my surroundings and began walking. I didn't know where I was. A nagging panic crouched in my subconscious, but I knew going down was good. My knees trembled as my feet took me carefully through the woods. My eyes had adjusted slightly to the darkness, but now that I was under the cover of trees, my vision was severely limited. I mentally crossed my fingers with each step, my fatigued limbs flopping with exhaustion. I focused on nothing but safely putting one foot in front of the other. The dark pressed in around me. The trees swayed overhead as the wind shook them, the sound filling my ears like high tide. Just as I was starting to become optimistic, something changed around me. Noises. Quiet at first, and then slowly growing in volume. I stopped, one foot planted on a downed tree in front of me. I swung my head around, eyes growing wide, throat clenching with fear. Something was crashing through the woods, headed right for me. Judging by the cacophony of snapping branches and crushed foliage, it was only 20 or 30 yards away and closing quickly. Making a split-second decision, I hopped over the log and rolled against it, wedging my body in as far as I could. I grabbed an armful of dirt, twigs, and dead leaves and pulled them towards me to cover my body. I waited, heart crunching against my ribs with violent terror. The crashing had almost reached me. It was deafening now. I swallowed hard and squeezed my eyes shut. And something huge and white flowed over the log, passing over me at an alarming speed. It crashed into the underbrush in front of me and then disappeared, leaving trails of cold fog behind it. I didn't move, paralyzed with fear. I listened to the sound of the thing diminish, the night returning to its dark soundtrack. I exhaled. What the hell was that? It didn't hold any form, just passed by me in a blur of faded mist. I was beginning to question my sanity. Things were happening outside the realm of possibility. The weird cake on the summit, the unexplainable growth of the mountain, the voice in the tent, it all came crashing down around me in that moment. I felt disjointed, my reality sinking in murky chaos. Am I dead? I rolled out from the log and stood, cautiously eyeing the black woods. I winced as the wind cascaded around me, slapping my battered skin with angry hands. I shivered and sunk into myself. I felt hopeless. I was impossibly lost. I didn't have a clue which direction to walk, and I was thirsty. I bent down and found a dirty pebble. I rubbed the dirt off it and popped it in my mouth. I remembered hearing that was supposed to help. As I rolled it around on my tongue, I decided that no matter what, I wasn't going to give in to despair. I couldn't. As soon as I let that in, it was over for me. I just had to keep working towards something. I had to keep myself as positive as possible. The temptation to panic was all too present. I could feel it under my skin, screaming and thrashing to be released. I needed to start walking again. Standing the ground, waiting for that thing to come back wasn't going to solve any of my problems. As I was about to go, I noticed something lying on the ground to my left, at the end of the log. I crunched down and examined it. It was a rope, about as thick as my thigh. I ran my fingers over the cords and traced it in the darkness. It was pulled taut along the forest floor and ran off into the woods, lost over the horizon of my vision. I felt a pang of hope. This rope led somewhere. Someone put this here. If I followed it, maybe I could finally get off of this god-forsaken mountain. My heart fluttered with newfound optimism, and I leaned down and picked up the heavy cords of nylon. I just needed to follow this out of here. I began to walk, the thick rope straining through my fingers. I noticed that it was vibrating slightly, as if the end was tied to something mechanical. As I walked, I glanced at my watch and saw that it was almost 4 in the morning. The sun would be up in about 2 hours. It felt like it had been days since I had seen the light. I ached for the warmth daylight would bring. The bones in my fingers seemed to crack in the cold as I gripped the rope. I swore to myself that if I ever got out of here, I was going to wear gloves for the rest of my life. My feet crunched through the foliage, brush and branches catching me at the knees. I pushed on, the rope leading me deeper and deeper into the woods. The constant vibration running through it encouraged me to keep walking. After another 20 minutes of slow progression, the vibrations became more intense. I shifted the rope in my grip, trying to get a better hold of it. It almost seemed like electricity was flowing through it, but that was impossible. I'd be dead if that was the case. I stumbled forward as something jerked on the rope. I let go and went sprawling to my hands and knees, wincing as something sharp cut into my palms. What was that? I wondered, brushing my stinging hands against my pants. I stood up and picked the rope back up, cautiously loosening my grip so I wouldn't get pulled down again. The rope jerked a second time, the cords crunching as the line went taut. I pulled forward, but didn't fall, keeping my balance and steadying myself against a tree. I leaned against it, waiting for another pull, but after a couple of seconds, I assumed whatever was causing it had ceased. I hefted the rope under my arm and was about to continue when I froze. They were all around me. Tiny black figures with eyes like hot coals. They were hovering in the air, small puffs of darkness pulled into human shape. Some looked at me from behind trees, their glowing eyes cutting into the black. None of them moved. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but I forced it down with a hard swallow. Despite the cold, I felt sweat along my spine. The closest one was about 6 or 7 feet away, above me to my left. It was just hovering. I scanned my surroundings and counted 8 of them total. Slowly, very slowly, I began to inch forward, continuing along the rope. My eyes were laser trained on the figures, snapping between each of them, waiting for them to react. They didn't move, only watched as I slid between the trees, away from them. I expected them to follow, maybe even charge me, but I remained the only one being in motion. My head was locked over my shoulder as I passed by them. I was holding my breath, begging the leaves underfoot to be silent as I crunched down over them. 1 step, 2, 5. I exhaled and took another couple steps, leaving them behind me. As I followed the rope deeper into the woods, I kept a vigilant lookout for any more of the strange beings. My mind was reeling. What were those things? The way they watched me, silent and unmoving, chilled me more than the wind. I forcefully pushed all thoughts out of my head, draining my confusion and fear like dirty water. Once I was safe, I could dwell on the questions, but for now, I just needed to get out of here. The rope continued to wind along the mountain, sometimes going down, other times leading back up. I had no idea how far I had come. After a while, I fell into a rhythm. Take 3 steps, adjust my grip on the rope, look around, take another 3 steps. I felt like I was in a trance, my mind a blank space between my ears. There was nothing that existed except the mountain and the wind. I realized that one could never get used to the cold. It chilled me as much as it had at the top of the mountain. Walking was the only thing that kept my joints from locking up, frozen in excruciating pain. I felt like if I stopped, I would just lay down and let fate have its way with me. The thought scared me, the temptation and ease of just giving up. I noticed I still had the pebble in my mouth. I spit it out and ran my tongue along my lips, what I wouldn't give for a sip of water. A blast of wind through the trees sent my teeth chattering again, and I slowed my pace and squeezed my eyes shut against it. My legs were trembling, rattled by the icy assault, my knees knocking together like two swollen walnuts. The air settled and I sped up. Would anyone come looking for me if I didn't make it out of here? How long could I last if this rope led to nothing? What would I do then? I shook my head in the darkness, trying not to let despair overcome me. One thing at a time. First, see where this leads, then go from there. I needed to focus on solving one thing at a time. Get to the end of the rope. I noticed that it was still vibrating, the strange hum running up the cords and across my hands. No sooner had I noticed than the rope jerked again. It caught me off guard and I fell, crashing down on the rocks and dead branches. Cursing, I got to my hands and knees, amazed that I hadn't done any major damage to my body. What the hell was doing that? I glanced at my palms in the moonlight, assessing the new scratches and cuts. I took a moment, filling my lungs with air, and then continued. The underbrush stuck to my pant legs, snagging and slowing me any chance it got. The ground was uneven and rocky as I crossed the ungroomed terrain. My feet were aching, each step sending a pulse of pain up my legs. The rope twisted its way between trees, around rock formations, and across thick foliage. I began to wonder if the rope went on forever. Between the noises of night, I began to hear something else. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I walked, the more I was sure. Running water. I started walking a little faster, as much as I dared in the dark, my mouth a dry sponge. The thick rope trickled through my fingers as I went, taking me closer and closer to the sound. My tongue felt like it was made of cotton balls, the distant splashing causing the sensation to worsen. My breath rattled out of dry lungs, exhaling what felt like mouthfuls of sand. I begged myself to slow. If I hurt myself now, it was over. With every step, I prayed I wouldn't roll my ankle. I just needed a drink of water. That would make everything so much better. It was close now, the flow of water on rocks filling the night. A few minutes later, I found it. It was a fairly large stream, maybe 5 feet wide. The rope led across it, floating perpendicular on the surface. I dropped to my knees and sank my face below, shaking with excited relief. The water was shockingly cold as I submerged my mouth, pulling in sweet mouthfuls of nature's lifeblood. I pulled my head up, sputtering and coughing as I choked. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to calm down, and then lowered myself and continued to drink. "What are you doing here?" I jumped and went sprawling, startled by the sudden voice. I stared around in the darkness, searching for the source. My heart galloped in my chest and my eyes went wide with shock. A man stood across the stream, staring at me. He looked to be middle-aged, a trimmed beard lining his face. He was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt that rippled in the wind. If the cold bothered him, he didn't show it. I pulled myself up, relief rocking me. I was saved. The nightmare was over. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, his voice a cool breath on the wind. I bumbled at first, the overwhelming relief jamming the words in my throat. I calmed myself, and then began to recount my horrible experience since I arrived. I told him about the singing, the cake, the tent, the strange black shapes with glowing eyes, everything. He remained silent as I spoke. After a moment, he said, "You're not supposed to be here." I blinked in the moonlight, confused, and explained to him that I was lost. I told him that I had found this rope and had been following it, hoping it led to something. His eyes darted to the rope at my feet and his tone hardened. You've been following that?" I nodded and began to feel uneasy. There was something off with this guy. I didn't know if it was the way he was dressed or the way his voice seemed to carry on the wind. He seemed completely passive until I mentioned the rope, and now his brow was furrowed and his face creased in hostility. He began to shake his head. "Turn around. Go the other way. You don't belong here." I threw my hands up, mouth agape. I told him that there was nothing back there, that I needed help, and that I was lost. I pointed down the rope and told him that following this was my best chance to find a way out. His face grew shadows in the moonlight, and his voice turned to frozen steel. "Listen to me. You do not want to know what's at the other end of that rope." I stood there, a response caught in my throat. I closed my eyes and looked down at my feet, eyeing the corded fibers. What was he talking about? I looked up at him and saw that he was watching me closely. I wanted to ask him a million questions and get some answers to the nightmares I had seen tonight. I wanted to know who he was and where he came from. I wanted to know what was at the other end of the rope. I wanted to know how to get out of here, but they dissolved on my tongue, leaving only the one question that had been hovering over my head since this began. I swallowed hard. Am I dead? He cocked his head, a small smile dancing at the corners of his mouth. You're the only thing on this mountain that isn't. His words confirmed what I had already feared. I shuffled my feet, watching the water run by. Silence grew between us. I didn't know what to say. I was afraid of the answers I would get. He broke the emptiness first. It wants to keep you here. My eyes met his again. What does? The mountain? He nodded, stepping towards me and placing a foot on the rope. You said the mountain appeared to grow? It doesn't want you to leave. For whatever reason, you were able to find this place and walk among us. And now, it doesn't want to let you go. My voice shook. Can I escape this place? He sighed and took another step closer, his feet splashing into the stream. Yes, but you better hurry. I don't know how much longer you have before you join us. We have already learned so much about you. There are those who would rather you stayed. My heart was beating hard in my chest and my voice came out in a whisper. What is this place? He was standing in the middle of the stream now, getting closer. It's where the dead go when they have no place above or below. He took another step towards me and I saw his eyes go red. And we can never leave. This mountain is our eternity. I took a step back, almost tripping over the rope at my feet. Why not? If I can go, why can't you? He was standing mere feet from me now. He pointed down the length of the rope. If you saw what was at the other end, you would understand. We are kept here. There is no hope for us. We're dead. He smiled suddenly, but it held no humor. Maybe one day you'll come back to us. Maybe there will be no room for you above or below. Maybe you'll get sent here. He was inches from me now, his voice grating up his throat. Maybe you'll get to see what this is tied to. He bent down and picked up the rope, holding it out to me. Take it. I hesitated, rooted where I stood by uncertainty and fear. I didn't want to take it, didn't want to look at it. I saw it vibrating in his hands, the dirty cord shaking in the dying moonlight. He offered the rope to me again. Take it. Follow it back the way you came. And trust me, you'll be out of the woods before the sun comes up. I licked my lips and took the rope, trying to find honesty in the man's eyes. That doesn't make sense. It'll be light in less than an hour. I've been following this thing all night." His eyes shined in the darkness. "Trust me, it's the only chance you have." I don't know why I believed him, but I did as he said. And he was right. Just as the sun peeked out over the mountaintops, I stumbled out of the woods, battered, beaten, and exhausted. I dropped the rope and fell to my knees, relief drowning me as I spotted my car. I couldn't believe it. I had made it out. I looked over my shoulder and saw the rope disappear into the foliage, slowly being pulled back by some unseen force. What the hell had I just lived through? Who was that man and why did he help me? At that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from this damn mountain. I stumbled into the car and pulled my keys out from under the seat, fingers trembling. I started my car and pulled away. I felt tears run down my cheeks and realized that I was surprised to be alive. I'm still haunted by that trip. I'll never forget the fear and horror I was exposed to. I haven't set foot in any woods since then, and I don't think I will anytime soon. One thing still scares me, though. It was what the man said. Maybe you'll get sent here. I've started going to church. Those words driving me to my knees and seeking comfort in religion. I don't care what I have to do, what kind of sacrifices I need to make. I'll do anything, so I don't have to go back to that mountain. I'll do anything so I don't have to see what's at the end of that rope. Many people find fear in the ideas of psycho murderers or evil spirits lurking about in old houses, or in strange cults that practice dubious rituals. There's no doubt that these things are to be feared and avoided at all costs. However, what gives me the most horrific sensations of terror I could ever feel isn't in any of that. Instead, I find it when I look at my own shadow. To this day, I have no idea what had led me to experience that unheard phenomenon. Even thinking about it causes me to shudder just remembering it. That nameless, hellish astral plane of existence. It happened many years ago, when I was very young. I was a curious child who had no true desire to spend it like other youngsters. I'd always spend time lost in my thoughts and read about subjects not many people usually take an interest in. I suppose that caused me to become ostracized by my classmates at school, and I never truly developed any real friendship. Ultimately, this led me to becoming very lonely, so I'd often find ways to entertain myself uniquely. Because I was so lonesome, I'd often spend time in my thoughts and observing odd little things that I would spot in random places. As a result of this, I began to take an interest in my shadow. Walking home from school on pleasant days, I'd often walk with my head down, studying it since I was so fascinated by it. The way it changed its height if the sun were a different position, or how it would change color or appearance depending on whether the sun or the moon was in the sky. I studied textbook after textbook on shadows and learned what they were scientifically and what other cultures all over the earth believed. I found myself absolutely intrigued by them and what they did. Although I found myself learning about them practically, I couldn't help but think about them in another way. I felt that there was something much more to shadows than what meets the eye. I'd be happy whenever there was a full moon, since the moonlight would pour directly into my room and give me a pleasant ivory tint to the dark. Furthermore, it cast shadows against objects on the wall, including my own shadow. This brought me oodles of fun and wonder. I'd spend hours at night entertaining myself by creating shadow puppets or flailing my hands around in humorous ways to have my shadow emulate me. One night, though, things became very different. As I drifted off to sleep one idle night after I had spent my time doing my usual routine of making interesting puppets against the wall and making myself laugh, I laid down to rest, and just as I was about to, I waved my hand as if I were waving goodbye and goodnight to my shadow. I suppose this was just my childish innocence at play, since after all, I was only a child when this all happened. This is where the eeriness truly began. I was waving my hand a bit too quickly, in that way kids do, in a way that things are too sloppy and careless sometimes, but my shadow's movement seemed to be a bit slower, as if it wasn't quite in sync with me. At first, I had thought that perhaps it was just me being tired and seeing things wrong. That happened to me sometimes, I guess. But as I lowered my hand and placed it by my side, my shadow kept waving its hand in that strange and slightly creepy way. And to make things even creepier, was that its fingers didn't resemble mine at all. They suddenly appeared longer, thinner, and the tips of the fingers appeared pointed and sharp. I suddenly felt afraid and sat up in bed, staring at my wall. My shadow was following my motions perfectly once again. My eyes remained on my shadow for a good 30 seconds, feeling nervous. What had caused that? I knew I was tired, but I was still awake enough to discern uncanny happenings. For a minute, I had thought that maybe something was in the room with me. That alone was enough to fill me with fear and shook the sleepiness out of me. And being only a youngster, I peered over the side of my bed and looked underneath to ensure that no monsters were dwelling under there. I lied back down, bringing my blankets up to my chin and my eyes swinging from left to right, but avoiding my shadowy silhouette. The next night, before climbing into bed, I pondered more and more about that weird occurrence. I had to have been dreaming. After all, that was just silly. Shadows can't move by themselves. It was most likely my tired brain playing tricks on me. When I hopped into bed, I played with my shadow once again, and as usual, dabbled in my puerile activities of making fun little figures. Thankfully, from what I saw, it didn't do anything odd or unsettling. I placed my head on my pillow and went into a sound, pleasant sleep. I felt myself stirring awake at some unusual and random hour of that night. I sat up in bed, lifted my hands to my eyes, and tiredly rubbed them. My eyes shifted over to the wall where my shadow appears, and what was there that night still haunts me to this very day, many years later. Although what I saw was indeed my shadow, it didn't reflect me sitting on my bed. Instead, it looked as if it were standing up completely straight. I couldn't tell if it was either standing right next to my bedside, or if it were just pressed against the wall. The most unsettling aspect of this uncanny shadow was that it seemed to have eyes. 2 shining purple orbs seemed to be on the upper side of its head. It just continuously stared mindlessly at me. My eyes widened and my mouth hung open. Interestingly enough, although I was afraid, I didn't feel the typical overwhelming horror that often associates itself with seeing something scary in the dark. Instead, it was more of a curious fear. A type of fear only children have, in which they are afraid, but at the same time have an element of curiosity along with it. As it saw me staring at it with those terrifying eyes, it suddenly began to walk. But as it did, it no longer looked like my own shadow. Its body grew a hunched back and the hands suddenly shifted to that grotesque claw-like appearance. The neck became elongated and stretched out, and it had a bestial, inhuman way of walking. I watched it move, and it gave me a disturbed, sickening feeling. It looked like the silhouette of some deformed imp or devil thing. Its head swung around, as if it were an animal scourging for food. Then, it disappeared into a more darkened, shadowless portion of the room, and it never came out. I stayed staring at the spot where it had vanished for a long time, too afraid to move a single muscle on my body. I don't even recall when I had fallen asleep, or if I had even fallen asleep at all. Perhaps instead I had fainted from seeing such a weird and somewhat horrible sight. All I truly remembered was waking up with that shadow in my mind, and if I should tell my parents or not. Unfortunately, my folks weren't very understanding of me. They often wondered if I was all right, since I didn't partake in the usual hobbies of children my age. Instead, they criticized me frequently due to my interests in topics they considered pointless or silly, and they deemed it unhealthy for me to be researching them constantly. If I had informed them of the disturbing experience I had witnessed, they'd surely roll their eyes and scoff at me. They'd accuse me of reading far too much nonsense and cast it off as some sort of ridiculous thing I had dreamed up. The next night, though, I noticed something. The phase of the full moon had passed, and I'd have to wait almost another month before it could appear again. This didn't mean the moonlight wouldn't seep into my room, though. It just meant that the light would be much weaker. This is where the nightmare truly begins, and I would forever doubt my own sanity. Before the events in which I am about to describe happened, I could at least still judge the situation as being some sort of bizarre lucid dreaming event. But now I knew I wasn't dreaming, and all the horrific images of those nights still plague me endlessly to this day. As long as the moon was shining even a little bit, the living shadow would freely crawl and walk around my room. I would see its loathsome purple gaze as its head creaked from left to right, as if examining its surroundings. I felt my blood turn into ice as its orb stared deeply into my eyes hungrily, as if trying to peel back the layers of my mind and fill it with madness. The impish thing would sometimes crawl on the ceiling and turn its head towards me and just keep its eyes on me for what seemed like all night. All I could do, helpless during all of this, would just be to look back and quiver beneath my quilt. It seemed to have some sort of form, which I saw as a grotesque, devilish humanoid shape, but it never seemed consistent. At times, it would appear like a strange little monkey, curiously lumbering about the room, and every once in a while would shoot a glance over at me. Other times, it didn't have any shape or form at all, and instead seemed like a black, shadowy liquid, gruesomely slithering about, going underneath doors and under my bed. One particular disturbing memory still stands out to me. One day, I saw the entity pour out of the wall, and it seemed to fade into the darkened region of the room. I had seen it do this quite a few times already, and, dare I say, I found it pretty normal at this point. But then, I saw the deplorable shadow suddenly morph into that weird, liquescent form and slip through my window. Shaken by this, I tossed off my blankets and quietly made my way over to it to see where it had gone. I peered outside, and even though it was dark, I could see the hideous shadow leaping from roof to roof of the other houses of my neighborhood with remarkable speed and dexterity until its silhouette suddenly vanished into the night. This went on for weeks, right until the night when the full moon was due to appear. I had no idea of the monstrous and ghoulish voyage that was now awaiting me, but if I had known, I never would have looked upon my own shadow. Before I relate what I'm going to say, I'm going to detail the toll this took on my daily life. I felt myself beginning to take a morbid descent into madness. Every day, I would feel terribly paranoid and troubled when I was around my shadow. Whenever I walked to school in the morning, I would attempt to avoid staring down to see it walking in front of me. Even shadows that belonged to inanimate objects gave me shivers. In the classroom, I could hardly focus on my schoolwork or the lectures. I often felt myself nervously glancing out the windows to see if the sun had reached the center of the sky and was beginning to cast shadows over buildings and trees. I frequently envisioned horrendously grotesque shadows beginning to envelop the walls and floors. One particular day, I was seeing those shadows far worse than before. Eventually, I imagined them stepping out of their natural habitat and began moving about the classroom on all fours, as if studying the objects in the classroom was some sort of abnormal curiosity. They had those wretched glowing purple eyes, much like the shadow that haunted my room. I did my best to conceal my nightmarish hallucinations from my family and my peers, but it became increasingly difficult as my teachers took note of my lack of participation during lectures and my family noticed that I was increasingly beginning to abandon my interests. It was as if I became a prisoner to these damned shadows. I couldn't take it. It was becoming overwhelming, and I had even contemplated taking my own life to finally put my mind at rest. I even saw these same evil shadows in my dreams. What I've said so far, though, was just a preface to the real horror and terror that would happen to me a month later during this whole ghastly ordeal. I honestly hope to the Almighty that it was just some sort of elaborate and vivid dream I'd had. It'll become very difficult for me to describe again, since some of it has been forgotten, but the portions I do remember still lurk around in my memories and leave me awake for hours lost in haunting thoughts. The full moon phase returned once again. I nervously glanced over to the wall to see that matterless, ghoulish acquaintance I've come to accept in my life. Amazingly, my shadow was absolutely normal once again. I waved my hands a few times and stood up to ensure that I was not, in an ironic twist, just imagining it. But no, it had finally returned to its appropriate state. It looked like me again. I was speechless. It was like I had woken up from a horrible, endless night terror, and I was greeted by a pleasant sunny day and had a refreshing breeze kissing my face with everything as it should be. I climbed out of my bed and slowly approached the wall with my arm outstretched. The return of my shadow felt like a beloved friend had returned from a long journey. For reasons I can't really describe, perhaps I was just intoxicated with happiness, I began to press the tips of my fingers against the wall, amusing myself with the thing that followed my every action. The sweet freedom of controlling my own shadow had returned. But just as I was doing this, my shadow suddenly developed these wicked purple orbs that served as its eyes, and it transformed into that grotesque and unnerving, devilish form once again. I cried out in fear and backed away from it, but to my horror, the upper half of its body suddenly popped out of the wall, and its long, gaunt arms wrapped around my body. I grew mad with fright and began trying to wrestle my way out of the monster's grip, but it was incredibly strong. I tried to scream, but my voice came out as weak and short in gasps. I was too afraid. I opened my eyes and stared at the blasphemous thing, and I immediately began to feel faint. It was so horrific and demonic to gaze into its eyes, I wouldn't even dare put it into words. The last thing I felt, if this is the correct way to describe it, was the shadow pulling me into the dark. I felt myself sinking as if drowning in some sort of otherworldly ghost pool, just going deeper and deeper until everything went black. When we fall asleep in an unknown area, we're often taken by surprise when we first wake up. We often expect to wake up in our rooms or homes, but we see surroundings we've never seen. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case at all for me. Before I opened my eyes, I could tell something was very wrong. It didn't feel like I was lying on my mattress or anything for that matter. I felt my legs dangling in the air, as if I were some sort of marionette on strings. When I opened my eyes, I cried out in horror. My head swung from left to right quickly, trying to gather where I was. I didn't see my room or my home. I didn't see anything familiar at all. Instead, I saw a sort of night sky. But the thing that made me fearful was that the sky was not what I'd expected. It appeared more like a strange, surrealistic night sky. The constellations I spotted were unfamiliar. The stars shined furiously and were much brighter than the stars I know of. Even though I said it looked like a nighttime sky, it had a more odd purple and blue hue to it. I saw shooting stars pass by a few times and bizarre distant planets that I'd never seen before. For a moment, I felt as if I was floating on water, or at least that's the impression I obtained. When I looked down, I shrieked in both astonishment and dread. I was hovering in midair. What was going on here? Where am I? Was this just some sort of bizarre dream? I felt myself breathing heavily, nauseous and thunderstruck with terror. I wanted to wake up. I wanted to go back home. I tried to move, but instead all I could do was glide. I felt as if I had no choice, so I did so. There were weird rock formations floating about, slowly and like the way clouds move by. They appeared like stalactites with platform-like tops just scattered about. The rocks had strange colors, dark blues and with tinges of green. I hovered over to one of them and stepped on it, and observed my unusual and nerve-wracking surroundings. I felt as if I had been taken to some strange and unreachable part of the universe. But how is that? I don't even remember if I were actually able to breathe, but I felt fine, for lack of a better word, in terms of respiration. I wasn't too well read in astronomy, so I couldn't tell if the formations and shapes of the stars were alien to the ones I knew. I ran to the edge of the rock formation and leaped and began to hover again. I felt like some sort of fish swimming in a cosmic sea of lost star constellations and chaotic dimensions. And just then, I heard an ominous and strange sort of chattering coming from below me. It sounded like a multitude of insects and snakes scurrying noisily in a large pit. I peered nervously down and saw a swarm of detestable shadows emerging from an unknown region from deep space with remarkable speed. And before I could fly away to a safer spot, the black and transparent beings wrapped themselves around me, and their demonic grips felt like a cold burn as I writhed and attempted to tear them off of me. They were like constrictors wrapping themselves around my arms and legs and dragging me down to God knows where. Miraculously enough, I was able to rip away from them and slide out of those shadows whole, and I floated away to another rocky platform, trembling from that strange experience. Now I had felt too nervous to aviate around freely. Those devilish things might rise up again and try to pull me down into the unknown once more. I felt helpless and stranded in this horrible dimension. But before I could organize my thoughts, another terrible thing awaited me. As I stood there, looking around to see how to escape this insane place, I heard a deep, baritone rumbling beneath me. It sounded like some sort of powerful earthquake were going on. Beginning to grow mad with fright, I made my way over to the edge of the precipice and glanced down. My eyes widened with horror as I stared at the hideous and deplorable fiend that I observed. An enormous and terrible monster lurked down there. It appeared to be made out of some sort of shadowy smog. It looked more like a living thunderhead slithering down there like some sort of massive, bloated serpentine creature. It detected me as I stared at it, because as I was observing this horrible thing, its grotesque face glanced up and its purplish eyes landed on me. It had a hideous frog-like face and grayish bifid tongue hanging out. I stood up with my eyes locked on the monster, and I immediately whirled around and attempted to fly away. As I moved away as rapidly as I could, I heard the monstrous thing's growls and roars behind me. I felt myself unwilling to turn around and face it. When I had first saw it, it left me with a sort of loathing and sickening feeling, almost paralyzing me with absolute horror. That beast's image was branded in my mind to this day, and I feel like I see it whenever I shut my eyes. I truly have no idea where I was fleeing to. All I knew was that I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible and out of this dimension or realm of madness and horror. And then I heard that repulsive noise once again. Those shadow beings were coming up from their infernal depths. I felt a cold and despairing feeling of helplessness overtake me. The shadows rose up and took hold of me once again, but instead of dragging me down, They held me in place, and I began to thrash furiously as I heard the monster's famished guttural cries growing louder and more excited. I did my absolute best to break away from their fiendish clutches, but it was no use. The shadow's strength and numbers overwhelmed me, and with my final breath, I turned around and saw that hideous purple-eyed shadow thing approaching me, roaring with his hideous mouth opened wide. I could see what appeared to be some sort of muscle organ that looked like a heart inside of it. It was covered with veins and seemed to have large, putrid valves and arteries attached to it. With each pulse, it seemed to change to a different color. It came closer, closer, and only then did I realize that I was screaming my heart out, mindlessly, and having a primal fear take hold of me. Never again was I able to look upon my shadow after that horrendous experience or whatever nightmare it was. All I remember next was waking up in my bed, sweating and trembling like a leaf. I wish I could properly claim what it was I had gone through that night. But I can't. I don't know. I didn't simply wake up and feel myself better and relieved that it was just a nightmare. No, instead, I felt myself so mentally destroyed that my parents later told me that they had heard horrific noises emanating from my room. When they entered, they saw me suffering from an extreme paroxysm of maddened fear. They immediately called for an ambulance and rushed me to a hospital. The physicians and medical staff had said they'd never seen someone suffer from such a nervous breakdown as I had. Many times they inquired as to what had led me to have it, but they never got a true response from me. I know that after treating, they'd immediately ship me off to some sort of insane asylum for what I describe. Many years later, I still have not recovered at all from that evil scenario. Now, I can hardly even look at dark areas without feeling a wretched loathing of it. And I sit alone for several hours with every single light in my house to prevent any sort of shadows from ever appearing too vividly. Every once in a while, as I lay on my bed at night, in complete darkness to prevent any sort of shadow from taking form, I believe I see two hideous purple orbs watching me, waiting for me to approach them. I know that soon, the shadow people will climb out of the evil darkness and pull me back into their lair, their horrible realm of shadows. James Anderson III stared down at a stainless steel table, smudged with greasy fingerprints from God knows how many doomed inmates before him. Sitting unceremoniously on top of the table was a grayish-white plastic plate filled to its edges with a diner-style breakfast platter. It included 3 fried eggs over easy, which were overdone, grits with butter, which were ice cold, and 3 strips of bacon, undercooked, with hash browns, overcooked, and 2 pieces of toast cut into triangles. A single pack of butter and a single jelly-labeled fruit medley sat on top of the cold toast. James stared at it a while longer. The thought of putting any of it into his mouth and swallowing made his stomach turn thrice over. The last meal. The last practical joke of his life. You would have to be completely insane to have an appetite at a time like this. The only reason he chose the plate of grease as his farewell dinner was because it reminded him of happier times with his family. The only happy memories he could recall were the ones of him and his little sister. When they were kids and his mom had a little extra money, she would take them to the diner at the edge of town. They would sit at the counter and his sister, Sarah, would get waffles with powdered sugar and syrup. Sometimes, the cook would sprinkle chocolate chips on them, and she would grin ear to ear arranging the little chocolate morsels into eyes, a mouth, and a nose to make a friendly waffle-faced creature on her plate. James always got the working man special, to seem more like an adult. It came with fried eggs that bled a rich, creamy yolk when poked, crispy bacon, hash browns, and a thick stack of toast with butter and jam. In truth, he often looked longingly at his sister's waffle plate, but he had concluded that only babies ordered that kind of stuff at 12. He had thought of himself as nearly a man. Those thoughts were worlds and worlds away. The reality was that being a man turned out to be one big, sick joke. A curse, he thought now, looking at his last meal. The platter in front of him, all these years and worlds later, was a poor imitation of the breakfast he remembered at the diner. James stared some more, eyes widening at the thought of his younger self and the long, torturous path he had walked to get to where he was today. "Not even gonna take a bite?" the guard asked from his post at the doorway. James shook his head slowly back and forth. "And after all that trouble we put into making you your special dinner? Talk about gratitude," the guard said. James knew he was trying to get a reaction out of him. The guard hated him. They all hated him. Everyone looked at him like some kind of piece of shit on the sidewalk, like something disgusting and unwanted, a smudge upon their good, clean world. The guard knocked on the glass of the closed door, signaling someone to take him back to his cell. James was glad for it. The smell of the congealing food was making him sicker by the minute. Minutes, he thought. How many do I have left? Another guard entered, unlocked the chain from the steel chair that was attached to James's handcuffs, and walked him out the door and into the hallway. He walked down the hallway and could see the other inmates in their cells, staring out at him with faces like floating masks. One was a grotesquely exaggerated mask of sorrow. Another was a fool's mask, cross-eyed and deranged. The fool laughed at him as he walked by. Another looked like a devil, reaching through the bars at him. The guard slammed his nightstick on the bars of the cell and the inmate jumped back, his face returning to normal. James stared at him as he walked by. They locked eyes, and the inmate, a middle-aged white man with thinning gray hair and a wiry build, ran his thumb horizontally across his neck and then waved goodbye. James was taken back to his cell to wait for the audience to arrive. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and it was to be carried out on that day, June 10th, 1992. The guard locked the cell door and looked through the bars at him. "Today is such a beautiful day for killing scumbags," he said before walking away with a little spring in his step. James wondered if they really believed he was guilty. He was an innocent man. He had only been a teenager when he was first jailed, accused of horrible things. Sometimes at night, he tried to imagine doing those things that they said he did. He couldn't. Sometimes the world twists in ways that make you question your reality. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I did do it, he thought to himself. He put his head in his hands and was surprised to find that he had more tears to cry. He let them out, almost savoring the sensation. Everything was his last. What would be the last thing he saw? What would be his last thought? He wanted it to be about his mother and sister. He had planned to close his eyes in that final moment and imagine an alternate reality, one in which his father hadn't died when he was 4, and his mother had never gotten remarried to a man who had repeatedly abused him and his sister. In this alternate world, James had gone to college and met a girl, and they both had worked hard to build a life together. They'd have one daughter, maybe, who he would name after his sister, Sarah. They would buy a little house somewhere, maybe even in another state. Maybe he'd move his sister and his mother to Maine. He had never been there, but his father had, and he had shown him pictures when he was a little boy. It seemed like a beautiful place. They would live there in a little cottage and smell the pine trees and the salty sea and be happy. He would picture that life from beginning to end, as they injected him with the poison that would kill him. Maybe death would take him there if he was lucky. James was pulled out of his fantasy by footsteps approaching his cell. They were heavy and slow. He didn't recognize them. He knew the sound of all the guards' footsteps, and these did not match. They got louder until a pair of old, worn-out penny loafers stepped in front of his cell. James looked at the shoes and then scanned up to the faded corduroy pants, the pot belly stretching the buttons of a beige, button-down shirt, a brown and yellow striped tie, tweed jacket, and finally, up to the round head of the man. His thin lips were mostly hidden by a graying mustache, and his nose was round and red, with long, dark hairs poking out. His eyes, a greenish brown, shone out at James from behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. "Hello, James," the man said, and smiled guiltily at having intruded on his solitude. "My name is Mr. Archon. I have just a wee bit of paperwork here for you to sign before the big event," he said, while rooting through a pile of papers in a folder. He looked at the grim look on James's face and corrected himself. "Well, that is to say, your execution, to be frank. Hey, what do you know? That's my first name. Call me Frank if you like," he said, with a self-conscious chuckle. "Are you a lawyer?" James asked, mostly just to say something. He wasn't expecting to see anyone else before they took him to the execution room. As if in response to his question, the cell door slid open with a metallic clang. Mr. Archon stepped into the room and the door slid closed behind him. James was surprised that the guards would use the automatic unlock system for this, he assumed. Unarmed civilian to visit his cell. But here he was, stepping into the cell of a supposed murderer without the slightest hesitation. The rest of the cell block was eerily silent. James had gotten used to the continuous sound of shouting, jeering, begging, and quite often, praying. He wondered who they thought they were praying to. The guilty had no business asking for mercy, and the innocent had obviously been left to rot by either a pitiless God or the absence of any God at all. James believed that the latter was more likely. What kind of God would deal out a fate like this? Sick joke indeed. "James Anderson III, yes indeed," Mr. Archon said as he found the paper he was looking for. He pushed his glasses up onto his stubby nose again and again as they slid down relentlessly towards the paper. "Well, Mr. Archon, I am not a lawyer, but a clerk of the state sent to tie up the loose ends of your case. With all due respect, Mr. Frank, my case has so many loose ends, I'd be surprised if you could tie them up in the few minutes I have left." Mr. Archon looked at James with an almost comically exaggerated expression of pity. He pouted his bottom lip out and shook his head. "What a world we live in that deals out such fate to a young man such as yourself. It really is a shame to meet you under such bleak circumstances, but alas, here we are, and there are still a few things we can accomplish before your time comes to an end." Mr. Archon shuffled over to the metal bed and sat down, laying his battered briefcase on its side. He popped the latches and shuffled through another mound of disorganized paperwork, whistling a little tune as he searched. James stood there, staring at the man, feeling that familiar wave of unreality wash over him. This could all be a bad dream. Mr. Archon's whistling took on a strange tone as the notes lifted up and down in a sad melody he recognized from somewhere. He closed his eyes and remembered his 13th birthday party. He had just turned 13 years old. He was sitting in his bedroom, waiting for his mother to get home from work. That summer, she had taken up a job cleaning houses, and he spent a lot of time alone. At the time, she was also married to her second husband, Tom. Tom was a traveling salesman that was often on the road, which was A-OK with James. Tom was a bad man. It was the only way his young brain had been able to put into words what kind of monster Tom was. He told his mom one time that Tom was a bad man, and she hadn't believed him. She said he had to stop reading those pulp comics. "They're turning your brain to mush," she had shouted defensively. But it wasn't the comics that had ruined his brain. It was the bad things that a bad man named Tom had been doing. On that day of his 13th birthday, Tom had come home to surprise James with a gift. He came whistling up the walkway, whistling into the house, and whistling up the stairs to James's bedroom door. It was a slow, cascading tune that turned James's blood to ice. "James, the birthday boy," Tom said outside the door with a flourish of little knocks. Tom opened the door and stood there in his shabby tweed jacket and faded corduroys, holding a wrapped gift. James sat frozen on the bed, hoping he would turn to stone and be unbreakable. He had hoped for it many times before, and sadly, he had remained flesh and bone. Thomas sat on the bed next to him, smiling like a lunatic. "Go on, open it." "Mom will be home soon. I'll open it when she gets home," James had whispered, never taking his eyes off of his shoes. His mind was already separating from his body, and taking him to the alternate reality that he had dreamed of every day since his father had died. Be a good boy and open it now," Tom said with a sudden biting intensity. He pushed the hair back from James's forehead and stroked his cheek. James's consciousness had blessedly floated up to the ceiling to watch the horror from afar, as it had done during the previous visits Tom had made to his room when his mother wasn't around. "Here we are, Mr. Anderson," Mr. Archon said gleefully with the paper clutched in his chubby fist. James opened his eyes to find himself back in the cell. "Be a good boy and sign right here for me, please." He held out the crumpled paper in one hand and a pen in the other. James stared at the man in his cell. With a dawning horror, he realized that he was looking at an aged version of his stepfather, Tom. He jumped back against the cell door, clutching himself tightly as he had as a child, trying to turn to stone. Now, James, there's no reason to be frightened. It's just a simple form stating that you are a very bad man who has done very bad things." "You're dead. I saw it in the paper. You died 15 years ago. You're dead," James said, clutching himself tighter. His whole body shook. Mr. Archon's smile widened. His eyes, which had seemed greenish before, now looked yellow. His eyes slid down his sweaty nose again, and those dead, yellow eyes stared nakedly at James's terrified face. They were the eyes of a corpse. "I'm not dead, James. You're dead. Dead as a doornail." He cackled and threw back his head with glee at his own cleverness. The thing that called itself Frank Archon stood up, and James watched in sick horror as one of his shirt buttons popped off his bloated, purple belly. The smell of decay filled the cell. James turned and gripped the bars, pressing his face against them to look for a guard. "Help! Somebody help me!" James screamed into a silent hallway. The hand gripped his shoulder and he screamed. He turned around and looked into the face of his mother. "James," she sobbed. She stepped back towards the bed and picked up one of the crumpled pieces of paper from Mr. Archon's pile. James looked wildly around the cell. There was no sign of the Mr. Archon Tom creature. He looked back at his mother, who was wearing one of her old house dresses. Her graying hair was coming loose from her usually neat bun. She looked very old and tired. And she was looking at the piece of paper with her hand over her mouth, aghast. "James, how could you?" "Mom, what? What are you doing here? What's happening?" he screamed, shaking and crying. "Breaking and entering, sexual assault, murder. Why did you do that to that old woman? How could you?" she said, backing away from him, shaking her head. You know I didn't do any of that. You know that. They framed me, he shouted back at her. Your sister is so disappointed in you. No, James said, sliding down the bars to the floor. I'm a statue, made of stone, and nothing can break me, he thought desperately. He cupped his elbows and made himself small, shuddering and gasping for air. Someone stop this. Someone help me, he said quietly to no one. Why won't anyone help me? He called out. There was no reply. The silence engulfed him. He felt paralyzed in fear and sorrow, and for a moment, he believed he really had turned to stone, a marble monument to his suffering. Here stood a boy who was fed nothing but pain, and in payment, was handed a death sentence for heinous crimes he did not commit. Justice is dead. Life is a sick joke. The end. An eternity passed, and the silence coaxed James out of his paralysis. He opened his eyes. A woman sat on his bed, a stranger. Her presence calmed him. She was young and beautiful. Her green eyes glowed out of a face with sharp, comely features. Her dark hair cascaded past her shoulders, shiny and smooth. She wore an expensive-looking black suit, tailored to perfection. She had one leg crossed over the other, and a foot with a pointy, black high-heeled shoe bouncing up and down. She looked completely at home and elegant in a jail cell on death row. What is this? Am I going crazy? He asked the woman. No, James. You just took a trip through your own brain, she said with a calm smile. My mother, she thinks I really did those things? He cried with the heartbreaking strength of a child. No, dear. She's waiting for you in the audience. She and your sister are heartbroken that you are paying for the sins of someone else. They believe you. I believe you. I don't understand, he said. His tears dried up at last, and he sat in stunned silence, waiting for something, anything to make this all stop. Mr. Archon was Tom. He's dead. He was here. No, I am Mr. Archon, she said, with the patience of a mother talking to her beloved toddler. You? Yes, James. I am Mr. Archon. I showed you those things. I don't want you to die without realizing the full extent of your misfortune. I want you to feel the injustice that has been done to you. Your life was worth so much more, and these people took it from you. Tom, the lawyers, the guards, all the people sitting out there waiting excitedly for you to die in front of them. I never did those things. They don't know me. I know that, my love, she said as she stood up. She reached down with perfectly manicured nails and took his hands in hers. He suddenly felt a warm, spreading joy that he had never known before being rushed through him. She pulled him to his feet and looked down at him. She was at least a foot taller than he was. James, she said as she tilted her head and arched one of her exquisitely dramatic eyebrows. Did you know that when your mother and sister were seated on the family side of the execution room just now, the mob on the other side threw things at them? No. Did you know that one man spat in your sister's face and called her a slut? No. Did you know that they are sitting in there right now, cursing your dear mother and sister for simply being related to a monster such as yourself? James shook his head no and looked down at the floor. He felt his cheeks go hot with the beginnings of deep rage. They are going to cheer when you take your last breath. When you think your last thought, they'll be laughing and smiling, and your family will walk out of there humiliated and harassed, probably for the rest of their lives. It's not their fault, James said, clenching his teeth. Of course not. It's these people, she said with a voice that echoed in his head through all the years of his life. All the injustices he had been dealt for simply being born. Wrong place at the wrong time, and here comes the punchline, he thought, through a thickening red curtain of anger. James squeezed his eyes shut and clenched his fists tight enough to make his fingernails draw blood in the soft pads of his hands. He gulped in the rancid air of his cell and screamed with every ounce of energy he had left. When the last of the howl had escaped him, he fell to his knees, panting. What can I do? What can I do? Do you believe in immortality? I don't know what you mean, he said, looking up into her beautiful face. I am the bringer of justice for lost souls. You deserve revenge. What will be your last thought, James? I don't know. I want my family to be happy. No, she said, her eyes flickering like flames. Suddenly, James's mind went black. It was relief. He could see himself standing in the blackness. Beside him was a figure in a black robe. A rotted hand reached out from beneath the cloak and pointed down. He looked down off a precipice into a never-ending pit of flames. They ebbed and flowed like the sea. Bodies were writhing down there, screaming and screaming. He saw Tom, and the judge that convicted him, and the lawyers that failed him, and all those people who were so excited to see him die. He smiled at their suffering. Mr. Archon's voice rang out beside him and he was back in the cell. Your death is inevitable, but a curse will last forever. It said. James could hear the guards' footsteps approaching. It was time. He smiled up at Mr. Archon, and it smiled back. The guard opened the gate and grinned at James. He didn't seem to notice a tall Mr. Archon standing behind him. He put James in handcuffs. It's show time, the guard said, and walked him out of the cell. James looked over his shoulder and smiled at his tall friend who nodded back at him. 2 guards opened the double doors to the holding area of the execution room. James could hear the crowd murmuring on the other side of the wall. His mind was clear. He knew what his last thought was going to be. The head guard nodded to the others, and they took him out to face the audience. A roar of noise erupted as soon as he emerged from behind the curtained area. One side of the room was filled with people screaming at him, their faces red with fury, some with tears and some with smug smiles. On the other side, separated by metal bars, sat his mother and sister. They were the only ones to mourn him. They were both crying and sat up straight when they saw him. He made eye contact with the sister and gave her a smile. The crowd grew louder at the sight of that. He looked at his mother and mouthed the words, "I love you." "Devil bitch!" someone shouted at his mother. James turned to the man and saw a flash of him burning in a pit of flames until he was nothing but blackened bones. The bones continued to beg for mercy. The man shrank back at James's stare and shouted no more. The guards walked him over to a gurney. He laid down willingly and stared at the ceiling, feeling as strong as stone as they tied his arms and legs down. Once he was strapped down, the man in charge of the operation, Master of Death, James thought, somewhat amused, asked him if he had any last words. He did. James turned and looked at his audience. My life has been filled with pain and horror. The injustices done to me and my family can never be fully repaid, but I can try. Today, I will be put to death for crimes I did not commit. Not only do you condemn me, but you condemn my family, who deserve none of this. I've had a day of my last, My last meal? My last piss? My last cry? My last conference with demons? I do not mourn my last day on this earth, because I believe in immortality. My body may perish today in front of you, but you will not be rid of me. I curse you. I curse all of you who came to see me die. I curse the ones who worked to take my life away, and those of you who did nothing to stop it. I curse the bad men who have hurt me over the years, and I curse this world for being what it is. I curse your blood. I curse every person who was born of your bloodlines. In this curse I will live on. When you think you've put all this behind you, I will be the chill that grazes your neck on a dark street. I will be the fear that creeps up on you and consumes you the last years of your life. I will be the sickness that takes your wife, your child, your own sinful heart. In your nightmares, I will live. In the deepest pits of your own hell, I will wait for you to join me. I am immortal in your suffering. Mother and Sarah, I love you, and I always will. The rest of you can go to hell. The crowd surged and had to be held back by guards. The needles were inserted into the veins of each arm and the poison injected. James looked at his family one last time and willed them to remember him as a good man. His sister sat up and screamed his name. "James!" she sobbed. His mother stood and pulled her close, kissing her head. She looked up at her son. "I love you, my sweet boy," she mouthed to him. James smiled at them both. The sound of the crowd was nothing but background noise to him. He turned his head slowly and looked up at the ceiling, feeling the poison rushing through him. There on the ceiling above him was Mr. Archon. It was up there in the shadows, just a pair of yellow eyes staring at him with joy. James closed his eyes and died, happy that justice had finally prevailed. I work as a barista at the Starbucks down the street. I usually work the morning shifts because it was the beginning of the day, which brought more customers and meant more tips, if any. One morning, when I was walking towards the Starbucks a couple of blocks from my apartment, I noticed a man sitting on the sidewalk in front of the door. At first, I assumed that it was just someone in desperate need for a coffee, but as I got closer, the dirty and tattered clothes gave it away that he was, in fact, homeless. We got a lot of them, being close to the city and all, and they would always loiter in front of the shops and say they had nowhere else to go, especially in the morning. So, we simply just shooed them away from the shop. As I prepared to approach him and tell him to leave, or else I'll call the cops, I noticed that this man was rubbing the bottom of his forearms against the concrete. I didn't really think anything of it at first, but when he noticed me, he gasped and grabbed the door handles and pulled himself up. It was dark, and his movements were quick, but I caught a glimpse of his face. It seemed deformed, his facial features swollen and lumpy. Scared, he quickly scurried away before I could even say one word to him. I walked up to the door and looked down at the spot where he was rubbing his forearms. The concrete was stained a dark red. Blood. Not much, but it was enough to suddenly concern me about the well-being of this guy. But when I looked up, he was nowhere in sight. I figured I'd wash it off with some hot water before opening the shop, so I quickly brushed it off, chalking his weird behavior up as some result of a weird drug. As I unlocked the door, I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, only to immediately pull my hand away. Some kind of wet substance covered the handle, its consistency similar to some type of cooking spray. Now, I'm not really much of a germaphobe, but you all have to agree with me that wet door handles are disgusting, especially if they're bathroom door handles, or, in my case, a door handle that had just been used by a cracked-out, crazy homeless guy. I quickly wiped my hand on my pants and went inside, and washed my hands with hot water and lathered them in soap a little longer than I usually do. After getting as much of the blood off of the sidewalk as possible and sanitizing the door handle of the hobo grease, I opened the shop and prepared for the morning rush. That night was when my hell started. After work, I was sitting on my computer searching for jobs, though more pointless things like Facebook and other sites were mostly distracting me. While typing in my computer, I looked down on my arms and noticed some light red dots on my skin, similar to mosquito bites. They weren't big or a deep red, just tiny spots no bigger than the head of a pencil eraser. No itching or burning. They were just there. I hadn't been outside at all that day, so it couldn't have been mosquito bites, and I didn't eat anything that could have caused an allergic reaction of some kind. My next thought was maybe fleas or bed bugs, but neither me or my neighbors owned any animals, and our apartment complex hadn't had any issues as far as I knew. After examining them for a bit, I ignored them. Whatever it was that was causing it would fix itself. The next morning, I woke up and walked into the bathroom. When I looked in the mirror, I was taken aback when I noticed more of the red spots speckled all over my body. Not only were my arms covered in them, but so was my chest, stomach, back, and shoulders, even my legs and feet. My neck was clustered with them. But thankfully, my face was spared as only a couple marked my forehead, cheeks, and nose. I'll admit, this did freak me out a bit, more so from how unexpected it was waking up to a sight like that. But when I noticed that these spots didn't still itch, burn, or bother me in the slightest, I decided not to worry about them, got dressed, and headed for work. Worrying about them would only make it worse, right? Throughout the day, I worked through the stares and double takes people were giving me as I took and made their orders. I noticed that the red dots were starting to get bigger and blotchier. And to make matters worse, they also started to itch. I tried my best not to scratch them, at least not in front of the customers. I knew that they wouldn't find it attractive to see the person handling their drinks scratching at some weird skin condition. After I got off work, I went home and immediately started doing some research on what the hell was happening to me. I researched hives, poison ivy and oak, skin allergies, skin conditions, psoriasis, everything. And from what I gathered, what I had was the result of possible hives, which are pretty much caused by anything. Stress, weather, food allergies, chemicals, clothing detergent, body soap, etc. Reading about this started to worry me even more than I was when this all started. I decided to schedule an appointment the next day with my doctor, just to get a professional opinion instead of advice from the internet. Night came around and I decided to go to bed early. The itching was still a nuisance, but not too bothersome, so I didn't bother buying anti-itch cream for the developing rash that my body was suddenly going through. The next morning I woke up and walked to the bathroom. When I looked in the mirror, you guessed it, the rash had only gotten worse. My skin was puffy and blotchy. Several areas were a deep red and felt bumpy to the touch. But the worst part was how itchy the infected areas had become. I scratched all over, which brought much relief but left dark scratch marks in the areas that I'd scraped with my fingernails. This sounds narcissistic, but I was happy to see that my face wasn't as badly affected by this reaction. My cheeks were pretty flushed, and my nose was puffy as well as my forehead, but I still looked like a normal person. Luckily, I didn't have to work this morning, but I did have my doctor's appointment in an hour, so I got dressed, ate a quick bowl of cereal, and booked it out of my complex to the clinic a couple of miles away. The doctor looked all over my body, asked me several questions such as the foods I had eaten, the detergent I had washed my clothes with, the animals I had been around, everything that was mentioned in the research I had done the day before. All of the answers I had given him had him conclude that what I had was simply a bad case of hives, and he gave me some steroid shots to help bring the reaction down and patch everything up. I picked up some anti-itch cream on the way home and went to bed for a nap. I had work that evening and decided to get some rest beforehand. When I woke up, I immediately noticed that the itching had gotten worse. I looked at my arms, which were even more swollen than the day before. All of my skin had become a deep red. The bumpy texture was more prominent than before, and as I looked in the mirror, I saw that most of my body was covered in the puffy, bumpy skin rash. My fingers were even swollen. My face was red, as if sunburned, and my nose even started to blister and peel. What the hell was happening to me? I called my work and told them that I couldn't make it tonight, but they told me that another co-worker, whom was also working tonight, had already called in sick, and that there was nobody else to cover me. I told them my condition, but they told me that there was nothing they could do and needed me to come in. After a few cuss words from under my breath, I figured that I'd push through the night shift and just get it over with. I asked if I could take off work the next day, in which they replied with, "We'll see what we can do." After slathering some anti-itch cream I bought on my entire body, I got to work. There, the itching got increasingly worse. I tried my best to scratch only when none of the customers were looking. Some even asked if I was okay, and I told them that it was just an allergic reaction so as not to gross them out as I made their drinks. I itched, I scratched, it felt like tiny bugs with spiky legs were crawling underneath my clothes, and I would rub my arms against the counter in an attempt to secretly scratch them. When behind the coffee machine, I would scratch furiously at my clothes before coming back out with a smile on my face and calling for the customer to pick up their drink. When there weren't any customers in the shop, I would run to the bathroom and scratch my arms and legs, chest and stomach, shoulders and back and scrub my hands as much as possible. After a few hours, I went to the bathroom and I noticed that I was bleeding, with scratch marks all over my arms and chest and stomach. The bumpy texture grew worse as well. The bumps had formed into clusters and clumps of yellow, bubbly pustules that shimmered in the poorly lit bathroom. I looked at my face. The skin on my nose flaked away as I scratched at it. The blisters grew into tiny bubbles that felt like bubble wrap. I noticed more blisters forming on my forehead, and even a few in my cheeks. While touching the blisters, I noticed that I had dried blood and pus stuck beneath my fingernails. How long had that been there? Was that there when I was handling the customers' food and drinks? I left the bathroom after I washed my hands for what was probably 10 minutes and returned to a line of customers who weren't exactly happy that they had waited to be served. As I took their orders, I rushed to get every drink finished. I was sweating from running back and forth and from the anxiety of what was happening to my body. I noticed blisters forming on my arms and fingers while preparing the drinks. The heat from the coffee makers made me perspire from my arms and hands as well, which began to irritate the blisters that were beginning to form. I began to feel delirious. I've never fainted or passed out before, but I felt like I was gonna. I began to feel lightheaded. "This isn't a grande iced caramel macchiato," a customer said. I looked over and saw her standing at the customer pickup counter. "Excuse me?" "This is a tall. I asked for a grande." With a couple of customers in line, I asked them to hold on for just a minute and walked over to her and said that I would make her a grande and give her a refund. I wasn't up for any argument from a customer and took the easy way out. "You know what? Forget it. Every time I've come here, I have received horrible customer service. This is ridiculous," she exclaimed. I apologized, but she wouldn't accept it and pushed the drink back. "I don't want it anymore. Just give me my money so I can leave." The blisters on my face tingled and burned. For a moment, I thought I even felt them pulsing and bubbling, as if they moved on their own. The customer and I must have been no less than 2 feet away from each other, but it was enough distance for her to be the target of the sudden pop and projectile squirt of pus and other juices that resided within the blisters on my nose. As a spray of yellow landed on her face, she flinched back a bit, unsure of exactly what just hit her. But when she opened her eyes and saw me patting my nose with my fingers and saw the loose string of yellowish-white coagulated waste stretching from the broken blister bubbles to the tip of my index and middle fingers, and she was well aware of the sudden health violation that she had now just been involved in. That night I was fired. The shop closed early. My manager told me that I'd be lucky if the lady didn't press charges. When I returned home, I took a hot shower. Very hot. Scalding hot. It burned like hell, but at the same time, it brought some kind of satisfaction to my blistering skin. I could feel my skin shriveling at the heat, and when I looked down, I saw blood rush down my body and down the drain. Every blister had popped due to the hot water, and thick, bloody pus gently squirted from each deflated bubble. I must have stood in that hot shower for at least an hour. I dried myself up and went to bed naked. My whole body burned and it was so hot. I turned my AC as low as possible and turned my fan on high in hopes that it would soothe the pain. But it didn't do much. I could feel my skin throb, tightening up and swelling as the rash took over. I itched horribly and I scratched all night long. I must have passed out from exhaustion, only to wake up the next morning in searing pain. I couldn't see. My eyes were swollen shut. They burned, as well as the rest of my body. I felt like I had fire ants crawling all over me, and I could feel them crawling and biting me, stinging me constantly as every inch burned beyond belief. I stumbled to the bathroom and struggled for the light switch. Even the touch to the wall brought immense pain to my fingertips. Once I turned the lights on, I forced my left eyelid open. It took me a second to pry it open as the dry pus from the blisters on my eyelid crumpled apart. What I saw was horrifying. My entire body was covered in blisters and bubbles. Huge ones. Blisters bubbling on top of other blisters, giant pus-filled sacs that looked ready to pop at any second. I'm sure you've seen those photos of third-degree burns that people get when they spill boiling water or grease on them. That's what these looked like. I managed to keep my left eye open and felt the blisters. They jiggled at the slightest touch and sent a huge surge of pain throughout my body. I doubled over, which only created more ripples of pain that almost brought me to my knees. The areas around these blisters itched and I attempted to relieve it by lightly scratching the bubbles, which helped a little, but it felt like the itching came from beneath my skin. I rubbed my eyes, as the eyelids were the only area of my body that didn't seem to erupt in pain when I touched them. I rubbed and scratched, scraping off chunks of dry pus and pulling at my eyelashes, which slid out of their pores easily, a follicle still intact. I had trouble opening my right eye. I pried it open with my fingers, and that's when I realized that I was blind in that eye, no matter how wide I pulled my eyelids apart. Upon closer inspection, I noticed tiny blisters growing on my eyeball. The itching grew worse. As I looked in the mirror, my form twisted and grew even more and more grotesque. I could feel the itching inside my head. I shoved my finger into my right ear and dug deep, scratching all around and scraping what I could only imagine being more blisters that developed on the inside of my ear canal. When I pulled my finger out, it was covered in blood. But it wasn't enough. I grabbed a Q-tip and shoved it inside of my ear and scraped it around. A huge sense of relief washed over my body, and I almost collapsed in the amount of pleasure that came with the scraping of the cotton tip against my blistered ear canal. I didn't even hear the loud pop and the ringing that followed as the Q-tip busted through my eardrum, which only exasperated the pain that my body was feeling. I yanked the Q-tip out and screamed in pain. Blood leaked out of my ear, mixed with pus and slivers of blistered skin. I grew extremely dizzy. The ringing in my ear disappeared, my vision blurred and grew black, and I passed out on the bathroom floor. I need help. I can't see out of my right eye, and my left eye is almost swollen shut now, with one large blister slowly growing larger on my eyelid. By tomorrow, the blister will probably grow over and completely engulf my eye. Every part of my body is covered in these blisters and they're starting to pop on their own. My sheets are soaked in pus and blood. I can barely move without coming close to passing out from the pain. I've tried calling the doctor, but the receptionist said that he didn't come into work today, and that he too was developing some kind of serious skin condition. My hair is falling out and sits in clumps on my desk as it falls in front of me, and my teeth are starting to fall out too. The blisters are beginning to form inside my mouth, and my tongue and throat are beginning to swell as well. Breathing is getting harder, and it's really starting to scare me. I thought about reaching for the gun that I keep in the drawer of my nightstand. And when I did, it all came flooding back to me. This is my punishment. This is my atonement. This isn't my first. This isn't my first punishment since I've been here. It happens again and again, over and over, every time my mind gets wiped to believe that this punishment is the first. I've been here for what feels like an eternity. I'm telling you this. I'm getting this message out to you that you won't make the same mistakes I did, that I don't want anyone to end up where I am. Even now, just thinking about it, I can see his devilish grin, his demonic smile, his maniacal laugh, all of the punishments that he has procured for me. I wasn't a very good man in life. I wasn't a good father. I wasn't a good friend. I wasn't a good person, and now this is where I am. Who knows what unthinkable, unfathomable torture will be thought up for me next when this one ends. I can't get the pictures out of my head. I can't get the memories out of my head of all of the other unthinkable inflictions of pain I've endured. This isn't the first, and it sure as hell won't be the last. You see, hell, it isn't demons and ghouls torturing you. There's nobody here with pitchforks. It's an endless cycle of misery. And it all feels real. It all feels like reality. It all feels like the life you lived before. Until the punishment comes to an end, and you're forced to remember and live and endure all of the punishments that came before. Until the next one begins. All you can hope for is that the next won't be as bad as the last. But don't hold your breath. Last year, I managed to scrape together a 6-week vacation. It all started in late June and went all the way through July. It took a lot of overtime and saving up, but it was going to be a magical time. I'd bought a new car and was going to drive state by state to visit friends and family. You know, the aunts and uncles you haven't seen for a decade, the cousins, the childhood friends. I had it all planned out. 5 days before the vacation started, those plans changed. I was coming back from lunch and a sedan blasted through a red light as I crossed the road. It clipped my left side, snapping my knee and shin bone, and did some pretty nasty damage to my left elbow as well. So all my packed bags were abandoned in the hall, and my new car was left to collect pollen dust in the driveway. It took me an entire afternoon just to call everyone and cancel on them. One by one by one. Maybe next year, right? So my magical summer was turned into an involuntary staycation. I live in a townhouse. Great location, about a 10-minute walk off Main Street. The house is split into 3 parts, each one a separate space. I lived on the top floor, 3 rooms and a kitchen. Not much, but spacey. There's an identical setup for the space on the ground floor, but that place hasn't been rented out in 2 years. The townhouse is constructed in a way that the various floors are independent of one another and have their own entrances, making it a sort of apartment complex in a way. There's also a smaller space in the basement. 1 room, 1 kitchen, a bathroom. It was supposed to be used as a temporary space for the landlord's kid, but they found some serious water damage and had to do some work on it. They figured they might as well do some touch-up on the plumbing as well. All this work, of course, coincided with my staycation. So not only was I supposed to stay at home for weeks on end, but I also had to do so to the sound of constant machines. Jackhammers, concrete saws, cars going in and out of the driveway all day long. After just 1 day, I could tell exactly what sound came from what machine. We also have this security system. If the door has been locked for more than 10 minutes, it locks up, and you have to input a code to get the warning beep to stop. That beep went off at least 2 times every hour. I could hear that damned thing beeping in my dreams. I tried to make it work. I got some ear protectors and tried to stream some shows with subtitles, but I could still feel the shaking. And temperatures were just south of 100 degrees, but I couldn't open the windows, or the construction sound would just get amplified. So I was stuck inside, in complete and absolute misery, with nothing but this droning machine torture as company for weeks on end. All the while, I could see my packed bags waiting for me by the door with nowhere to go. I could barely move. With some effort, I could make it to the bathroom, kitchen, and then back to bed. I had a friend of mine come by with some groceries about every 3rd day, but most of the time I was on my own. I would count the minutes until the repairman clocked out. That was my only time of day to get some actual rest and to watch something with the sound on. It was one of those nights when I was up rewatching The Sopranos when I heard yet another car come up the driveway. It was somewhere around 11 p.m. As soon as I heard that grating motor, I got this Pavlovian response to cover my ears, but it was just a car. But after living through nothing but construction noises all day, I couldn't bear the thought of the slightest inconvenience in the after hours. I hobbled over to my window, ready to get into a scream fest. If I heard a single bang of a hammer, I'd be filing a noise complaint. I was on edge, and frankly exhausted. Just standing up, even with a cast, felt like having glass shuffled around inside my broken leg. And the itching. Gotta ignore the itching. But when I got to the window, I saw something I wasn't prepared for. One of the repairmen had brought his private pickup. He'd also brought his teenage son along. Together they started unloading what looked to be about 20 pounds of planting soil, a box of candles, and about a dozen arm-length lead pipes. I was dumbfounded. I'd been readying myself to get into a screaming match, but now I was just confused. They went into the basement in waves, carrying everything inside. Then they just stayed down there for some time, at least 2 hours, maybe more. I watched them as they left. They seemed excited. The son was moving back and forth, making wild gestures, and the dad kept smiling and nodding. When they drove away, they turned up the music and kept the windows rolled down. They were having a little party of their own. The next day, no one showed up. It was a Wednesday, and they should have been there, but no one came. All the tools were left outside. They were far from done. The driveway was a mess, and there was plenty of work still to be done. But still, I couldn't complain about having a quiet afternoon for the first time in weeks. I spent the day without my ear protectors, rewatching all the Jurassic Park movies. That night, 2 cars pulled into the driveway. The guy with the pickup from the previous night, and an old mud-colored sedan. 4 people in total, none of which I recognized. And 2 guys, 2 women, all of them somewhere in their 40s and 50s. I couldn't see what they brought, but it was entire bags and boxes full of stuff. The only thing I could recognize was a handful of royal blue plastic tarps and rope. They were down there for hours. I hobbled over to my front door to listen to what they were doing, but all I could hear was speech and a little cheer every now and then. At one point, someone exclaimed something and the others laughed. It sounded like they were having a good time. I didn't like it, not one bit. They didn't leave until 3 in the morning. I heard them get into their cars, laughing all the way. I was tired enough to almost fall asleep standing up at that point, but I decided to do something. I wanted to know what was going on. It took a lot of effort just to convince myself to try. I had my phone with me just in case. A wrong step could send me right back to the emergency room. I got out the front door, hobbled my way to the ground floor, and all the way up to the side of the house to the basement entrance. It took me about 15 minutes. The basement had been locked up for the night, but my front door keys could open the lock for both the ground floor and the basement. Perks of having a lazy landlord. The lock clicked open. More stairs. The ceiling light didn't work, but there was a large flashlight right by the entrance. I grabbed it and continued downward. The air was damp with smells, mostly soil, but also dust and plastic. The space wasn't supposed to be very large, but they dug out a massive chunk of ground. It didn't take much effort to see that something wasn't right, though. The entire concrete floor had been ripped open. This was probably part of fixing the water damage. They'd covered the raw dirt with blue plastic tarps and then started to fill it in with planting soil. Along the edges of the dugout hole were lead pipes. They'd been driven into the ground and had a candle placed atop, like standing torches, and 12 of them in total, in a perfect circle. And in the middle of that circle was a safe. It was this massive iron box, like some turn-of-the-century level thing, as tall as a small child. It was balancing in the middle of the room on top of a flat rock, the only space that hadn't been dug out. The safe seemed brand new, like it had been polished and cleaned. It looked like the crew had just started to dig out the floor, but as soon as they encountered this, it excavated it completely. There was a ladder leading down into the hole, but I couldn't use it. Not in my condition. I remember just standing there with a flashlight in hand, not knowing what would pop in front of me next. It felt surreal. There were little details all over the place. An empty wine bottle in the corner, little holes in the dirt where seeds had been planted, a watering can by the edge of the stairs, and there were blankets covering the edge of the hole, making it easier to sit by. Not that I would. I also noticed cigarettes, a radio, and batteries, and candles everywhere. And the exposed pipes on the floor on boxes lined against the walls. Like I said, everywhere. I tried to make sense of it. Whatever they were doing down there wasn't part of the job. But still, I had a hard time figuring out what exactly they were up to. Hello? The voice was distant, yet clear. I got the mental image of a flower bursting through concrete, something making its way through a barrier. But there was no question about it. It was coming from the safe. I think it was a woman. I'm sorry, are you new here? I leaned against one of the beams for support and fixed a flashlight on the safe. It was large, but not large enough to fit an adult woman, unless she was crammed in there. I was having a hard time seeing how a voice could come out of it, so I brought out my phone to record it. Hello? Hi, can you hear me? I caught it on tape and played it back to myself to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I saved the recording. It's a bit quiet, so I enhanced it. Finally, I decided to speak up. Yeah, I'm here. I hear ya. Oh, hi. I'm sure this must be all a bit confusing. Concerning, yes. Not sure what to make of it. I pulled out a wicker chair from the corner of the room and sat down. I placed the flashlight on a box, keeping it fixed on the safe. I'm sure it looks quite strange, but you're free to leave at any time. I would certainly hope so. Let's try this again. I'm Angela. No need to tell me your name. I already know it. I've seen a lot of people come down here for the past few days. It's strange. It's mostly harmless fun. Angela said. But yeah, I can see how that might be alarming. Yeah, not a lot of people come by construction sites to hang out. It depends. If your favorite band were playing here, you might want to go. Sure, but they're not. They could be. I leaned forward, giving the strange safe another look. I couldn't see any markings. The numbered wheel in the front looked blank. I could show you if you want, but I need your consent. Your consent to what, exactly? To show you why people come to stay with me, but I don't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Will it hurt? Not at all. All right, then. In the blink of an eye, I felt wind rush towards me. The brightness of the flashlight extended to a wide-open sunlit afternoon. I heard a roaring engine, and I could feel the smooth texture of leather against the back of my legs. As I opened my eyes, I was somewhere else. It was an open highway, a sunny day with wind rustling my hair. I was in a car, an open convertible. An old friend of mine was driving. I was in the back seat with my high school sweetheart. I could feel the condensation from an ice-cold bottle in my hand, and the warm wetness of a kiss on my cheek, a whiff of her intoxicating shampoo. This wasn't a memory. This was happening right now. Mind if I turn up the bass? My friend called out. Don't want to listen to you make out all day. I immediately lost all reservations. I forgot about everything. I spent hours, maybe an entire day, just hanging out with my old friends. I was younger, stronger, happier, not a care in the world. Money in my pocket, a pep in my step, and not a single cloud in an open sky. It wasn't just pleasant. It was beautiful, heavenly. We had drinks and dinner at a great barbecue place, and found a neat hotel just as we thought about calling it quits for the night. Every sensation filled me with joy. Warm kisses, cold drinks, a hug from an old friend. It bolstered me, strengthened me. And then it faded away, sand running through the fingers of my mind. And there I was, with a broken leg in a dusty, broken-up basement. I'd been gone no more than 30 minutes, even though it felt like an entire day. Are you okay? Angela asked. I didn't know how to feel. It was strange being back, but all the sensations I'd experienced still burned in me. I could feel it in my skin, in my mind. It was amazing. I think I'm good. I don't know what to say. I suppose you want an explanation? Yeah, that'd be great. For the next hour or so, Angela told me a story. Back in the day, that safe was just a peculiar thing. It was made back in the times of the Old West, and they'd cast it from a strange metal they'd found in a drained lake. It was supposed to be used as part of a bank vault, but they noticed the money inside would be slightly changed. At first, it had just changed the value printed on the bills, but over time, the changes would become more drastic. Some money would be turned into flowers. Silver would turn to glass. There were seemingly no rules, except that things would change. So, in one of the many grueling cruelties of the West, someone decided to stick a child in there. Hence, Angela. Ever since, the safe has been closed. Not even Angela can open it. She grew up in a space where there was no need for nourishment, sleep, or breathing. All she knew was the darkness of that alien box and keeping her in some kind of suspended animation. I've dreamt about the outside. I've dreamt about it for so long, she said. Can't we just let you out? It won't open. It can't. And even if it did, I'm pretty sure that'd kill me. So you're just stuck in there? Forever? It's not all bad. I can go wherever, be whoever I want. The only world I've ever known is the one where you close your eyes and just live. And I can share that experience with you, my friends on the outside. I mean, that was... I've never experienced something like that. But this seems incredible. Shouldn't we call someone? Do something? I suppose you could. Maybe the police or your landlord, maybe a great scientist. But who's to say they won't put me somewhere bad or use me for something sinister? How do you know I won't do that? I'm not better than anyone else. I'm a pretty good judge of character, and I think the two of us will get along just fine. We chatted for another 30 minutes. Just small talk about everyday life. My job, my relationships, my dreams and hopes. She was very curious and supportive. When I finally had to leave to get some sleep, I couldn't help but long to be back. But before I left, Angela stopped me. "Next time, won't you bring me something?" she asked. "It feels good when things change. That's why they bring things here. A poster, maybe some crayons to draw on the walls." "Why?" I asked. The safe, it needs things to change. If they don't, it sort of lulls itself to sleep, bringing me along." "So, you need an offering?" "No, nothing like that, nothing dramatic. Just something that changes the space, makes it look different, or feel different." "I'll think about it." The following day, the construction noises were back with a vengeance. Louder, seemingly random and nonstop. They'd brought in not only concrete saws and jackhammers, but also a wood chipper. I was exhausted from the previous night and spent most of the day just trying to keep my eyes shut. But there was something else as well. I didn't want to get up. I wanted to stay in bed and dream myself back to that impossible day. The wind in my hair, the open road, all worries so far behind we couldn't see them in the rearview mirror. The real world felt cold to me. Awkward, like a cocoon wrapped around a struggling insect, yearning to fly free. That night I skipped dinner and went straight for the basement. I was halfway out the door when I stopped to consider Angela's wish, that I'd bring something. I considered skipping it, but there was that tiny part of me that feared that if I did, she might not want to show me that magical space again. But if I did, I was subjecting myself to her wish. Then again, it was up to me. I could make my own choices. I decided to bring her an empty flower pot. The plant in it had long since died, and I didn't have a use for it anyway. She seemed to like flowers and dirt, so why the hell not? But the basement door was already open. This time, I wasn't alone. There were 2 repairmen down there, along with 3 random strangers. All the candles were lit, casting a warm light across the room, and making the shadows dance on the walls. They were all lying on the floor, some inside the pit with the safe, others on the concrete floor. They looked like they were sleeping, twitching, grunting a word every now and then, little chuckles, sighs of relaxation, like the strangest slumber party I'd ever seen. The wicker chair I'd sat in the previous night was waiting for me. "I'm glad you came back. Thank you for the gift. I figured you'd like it, seeing as you have potting soil and all that." I looked around. Standing among these restless strangers felt wrong. They looked too happy, too content. I felt like the only sober guy at a party. "Why do you do this? What's in it for you?" "I get to live with you, and I can't do it alone." "But what's the point? It's all fake. What's the point of any experience in the end? It all goes away with us." "Sure, but with that point of view, nothing matters. So let's make the best of it while we can." "Wait." The blink of an eye. A sunset beach on a tropical island. Palm trees swaying in a warm breeze. Children playing in the water. Distant strumming on a guitar. And the thumping bass of a party. Freshly cut honeydew melon on a platter to my right. And an entire night of possibilities ahead of me. "Angela, we should talk about this." I knew I wasn't really there. That strange sensation in my stomach was still bothering me and telling me that this was all wrong, unnatural. But being there, in that moment, I couldn't discern it from reality. This was Angela's dream for me, and she wanted me to be happy. I was already there. Why shouldn't I indulge? Over the next few days, I started to get to know the other people going down there. Some were part of the construction crew, others were their friends and family. Some went down there to spend time with people that had passed. Others were living out dreams of long-lost love or missed opportunities. This one guy was obsessed with the TV show, and Angela helped him live out his dream of being a part of the cast. There were about 12 people overall, and I got to know some of them pretty well. The amount of time we spent with Angela changed from day to day. Some experiences could last for days on end, while only spending hours in the real world. My longest time was about 3 days, while only taking about 2 hours of real time. I was the VIP on a Caribbean cruise, and being pinballed between an open bar, smiling faces, and never-ending comfort. And once I stepped out, the others were there for the come-down. We shared our experiences, had a few cups of coffee, and went on with our day. Some wouldn't leave, though. Some would stay there. I lost track of time overall. I missed doctor's appointments, checkups, follow-ups, all of it. I stopped taking calls, and I forgot to give my friend money for groceries. I started having real trouble discerning my real needs from the comfort of dreaming. I only ate and slept because my come-downs would get worse if I didn't. The moment where you come back to your body can be devastating if you're hungry, tired, and thirsty. That's why I brought some wine. It was easier to come back if you were a bit buzzed. I was involved with this group for about 4 weeks in total. It felt like a lot longer, since every time we went along with Angela, it would feel like a day, or several, in and of itself. I went on countless adventures, to the point where I started to dissociate from my body. I'd forget all about my needs and wants. Like, what's the point of changing your shirt if you're only going to be awake in this body for another 6 hours or so? It kind of felt like putting on a 3-piece suit before heading to bed. My leg was still broken. I had people come by to help me downstairs, and a lot of us had fixed up that space pretty well. We'd hung lights along the walls, and colored the concrete floor with crayons, and watered the sprouting flowers growing from the pots and soil. I don't quite know what they were supposed to do, but it was called Helianthus caerulea. Apparently, it was Angela's favorite. We'd made that space our own. Then there was that one night. There were 26 of us in total, all gathered in that basement. I sat in my wicker chair. Others were spread out all across the room. There was this sense of anticipation in the air, like charged static. We could feel tonight was going to be special. And finally, her voice came through. "Oh, isn't this something?" laughed Angela. "So many friends. Thank you for this. This confidence. I don't deserve you." Some laughed, some just smiled. There was a young couple leaning against one another in the corner, raising a drink towards the safe. Good vibes all around. "Tonight, I want to meet you all. There on the other side. Is that okay with you?" A cheer rose from the crowd. Of course it was okay. We loved Angela. We were dying to see her. "You're all too kind. Sweet dreams, my loves." As I exhaled and closed my eyes, something unfamiliar blanketed my mind, and when I opened my eyes, I was somewhere I'd never been before. I was looking down at my naked feet, buried into black sand. My legs were glazed with the light from a red sun setting over a white horizon. A dark, endless ocean spread out in front of me. The others were there as well. Some looked younger or healthier, but we were all there, our best selves, relieved of worry and pain. "It's different," someone said. "We're really here. We're all really here." Some cheered. A couple of girls were dancing in the water. The young couple was making out, rolling around in the sand. I just stood there and taking in the magnificent view. Closing my eyes, my real life felt like the dream. This was the actual me, dreaming that I wasn't a miserable office drone with a broken leg. A hand brushed against my shoulder. "I'm glad you're here," Angela whispered. I looked up at her. Angela was 7 feet tall. It's hard to describe her. She was sort of devoid of color. Not white, not black, just uncolored. No hair, no scars, neither man nor woman. She looked like a quasi-person who hadn't yet decided on what to be. She had no facial expression. Her eyes had no color, and the strangest detail was her hands. She had no fingernails. I could imagine her looking down on me with benevolence, but at that moment, there was nothing. No matter what I imagined, I could tell there was nothing there. She gave me a pat on the back and turned to the others. "Tonight, you don't have to leave. You can stay as long as you want. You can go wherever you want. You can go together, alone, or as a group. There are no restrictions. Your generous gifts and all your confidence in me have realized my full potential." She dove into the water. We followed her. Others crowded ahead of me, eager to follow her into the deep. I lagged behind. "Let's go together for a swim to distant shores and untold lands beyond." My leg hurt. There was this uncomfortable nerve pinch shooting down the side of my body. I looked down. I could feel the water pooling around my feet. I was perfectly fine, but I could still feel the pain. The real pain. Looking back up, some people were gone. I tried to find the young couple, the girls who'd been playing by the water. Counting heads, I only saw 19 of us. Had some of them gone ahead? As I scanned the surface, I saw a head dip under the water. They didn't come back up. One by one, and people started to doubt. Some looked at one another, unsure of what to do. Angela, who was the furthest out, urged us to hurry. "Come then, it's not that far." I saw a man ahead of me have a change of heart. He turned to head back to shore. He met my gaze for a second, and in the blink of an eye, he was pulled under. Panic. We fled back to the shore. I saw something moving in the waves. Some who dipped down to come back up, screaming for help. Others just screeched like wounded animals. A cacophony of horrible realizations came to me at once. "Let go of me! Let go!" one screamed. "It's got me! It's got me! Please, please, no!" As soon as something cold touched my toe, I flinched. And for a moment, the spell was broken. I was back in the real world, standing at the edge of the concrete hole. Everyone else had jumped in. Some were having seizures in the dirt. Others had stopped breathing. I saw a young man with a broken neck. I had been putting my weight on my wounded leg, which had distracted me from jumping in myself. I'd been compelled, but that tiny bit of pain had kept me grounded. The safe was slightly ajar, and something was emerging from within. Then I was back on that beach. White algae was spreading across the black sand like sickly veins. I saw one man being dragged into the deep. No matter how hard he dug his hands into the sand, there were only a few of us left. "Just a little further. You're almost there." Angela's voice boomed across the horizon. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My leg hurt too much. But I clung to that pain. I let it radiate through me. I listened to it, and I let it pull me back to whatever was actually happening. Reality. That spiking ache enveloped me, and I opened my tired eyes. Something let go of my arm as I pulled my way up back from the edge of the hole. There were only a handful of bodies left. A colorless arm emerged from the safe, Grabbing a middle-aged man by the leg, it started pulling him back. "It's not too late," said Angela, her voice much clearer now. "You can still come with us." "What the hell are you doing to these people? What is this?" "They're coming with me. We're going away." You're killing them. You're killing us." "With your consent." The body of the middle-aged man snapped and twitched as it was forced into the safe. It reminded me of a snake with an unhinged jaw, devouring its prey whole. Something grabbed my healthy leg and pulled me forward. I tumbled into the pit, right next to the safe. From there, in that angle, it looked enormous. My heart pounded, trying to leap out of my chest. This wasn't a well-meaning dream fairy. This was a damn predator. I don't want this." "You said you did." You don't have my consent. I say no. No. You don't want this. No, I want to go. Right now. There was a moment of consideration. The safe was left slightly ajar. Angela took a deep breath. "I'll make you want this." In the blink of an eye, I was in a scorching desert. I was chased by rabid beasts longing to rip me apart. They seemed to get closer and closer the faster I ran, and the sand dunes went higher and higher. Sweat stung my eyes, and my lungs were aching from exhaustion. In a way, I knew I could give up. I could give in. I could take Angela's hand and walk peacefully into the unknown. But the beasts caught up to me, and mouthful by bloody mouthful, they started tearing me apart, leaving my body broken and exposed in the sand. My throat struggling to breathe. I could feel myself slipping in and out of consciousness. "Tell me when you're ready to go," Angela whispered, brushing my hair. "Just take my hand." I wanted to, but I could still feel my broken leg. This wasn't real. Over what felt like weeks, maybe months, I was tortured. I was shot, drowned, eaten, burned, dismembered. All of it. The worst part was when she put me someplace where I knew it'd happen eventually, but not immediately, or when it could happen at any time, but I didn't know when. I had everything I loved destroyed in front of me. Every dream turned to nightmare. I was back in that car, with the wind rushing through my hair, and my high school sweetheart punctured my eyes with her teeth. I was eaten alive by family and friends. I was buried alive, hearing people dance on my grave through rotting ears. All my screams went unheard, and all my tears meant nothing. This would never end. This would never stop. A never-ending parade of misery. And no matter how much I screamed, cried, or begged, it didn't matter. I had to submit. I had to give her my consent. I had to, or this would keep going. But I held on to my pain. The real pain. I knew that somewhere out there was the actual world, with real horrors and real experiences, where dreams were just dreams. At some point, I awoke in an ambulance, an oxygen mask chafing against my nose. I could smell blood. I couldn't move my arms, and there was a strange tingle in my fingertips. A deafening siren pounding my ears. "He's coming too," someone called out. "Sir, sir." I remember looking into the eyes of a young man standing next to me. He was trying to check my pulse. "My leg. It hurts. It really, really hurts." And it did. It really did hurt. For real. One of the other contractors had been wondering what was going on. and people had stopped answering his calls. He'd come around to check on the place, only to find me, alone, unconscious in the basement. He'd called an ambulance. Apparently, he didn't stay long enough to listen to Angela, or maybe she was busy talking to me. They pulled me out and took me to the hospital. I fell in and out of consciousness all the way through. And meanwhile, repairs resumed. The first thing they did was fill in the floor. No one told me what happened to the safe. As it turns out, I was in Angela's world for 3 real days. There were some inquiries about people going missing, but apparently it isn't as uncommon as one would think. My episode was attributed to an overdose on painkillers. The others, well, there wasn't one single explanation. I tried talking to people about it, but it was hard to make them listen. I'm talking about it now to remind myself that what I experienced was real. I can't talk to anyone else about it since anyone involved is, well, gone. I've since moved to an apartment instead, and my leg is better. And the further I get from that day, that summer, the more it feels like an impossibility. But I know it happened. I know it did. I think what stayed me in the end was getting away from that place. But still, in my heart of hearts, I have to admit, I want to go back. Maybe if I'd followed her, everything would have been okay. But then again, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't.